So before we get started, I want to hit on a few things. We've had those two meetings, one in Pinedale, one in Worland, very productive meetings. Had about 27 people at each one of those meetings, good engagement. But we also felt, we've learned that we probably want to give a little more of a background and how we got where we are today and how meaningful this is to the department on this topic is, the people that have been involved in this, they've dedicated their lives to managing Wyoming's wildlife resource for you folks. And so I just want to hit on a few key points to think about as we go through this tonight. So a lot of things you've probably heard. There's been things on social media, discussions, whatever, but first and foremost, please base your thoughts and comments on the actual plan. We ask that you go out, read the plan, and provide good, thoughtful comments on what the plan says versus what you think it says or what other people are telling you what the plan says, because there's already been a lot of misinformation presented out there about the plan. So please read it, provide us comments, which we'll talk about later, how to submit those. We understand this is a very emotional issue. Possibly increasing harvest on buck deer is a big issue. And we understand that there's some concerns with we're going to hunt our way out of this, whether that's through a hunting season, some other type of lethal removal. We get it, we understand it. We're as passionate about these species as you folks are, and again, we dedicated our life to it so you folks can enjoy it. Again, it's our mission. We're the stewards of your wildlife, and we have to do, we feel it's important that we do management actions that meet that objective of conserving your wildlife. And again, the biggest thing, we all share your fears, or your trepidation, or whatever you may call it, that, what will this look like at the end of the day? We understand that, but we're here to work together and make sure we do what's best for Wyoming's wildlife. A big thing, number two, strategies to plan are management options. They are not set in stone, they're options. Whether and how we implement is up to the local wildlife managers and the public, you folks. Nothing is set in stone. We're not going to do A, B, C, D regardless of what anybody says. There's going to be a lot of additional public engagement. Again, we understand your fears and concerns that significant measures could be taken without adequate, appropriate data and planned outcomes. Again, this is not going to be made in a vacuum. This is going to be a very transparent, open process as we move forward once the plan is approved, and how we take or address management. And it could be hunting seasons, it could be a variety of other things. And finally, there's a lot of things we know about CWD, but there's a lot of things we don't know. There are risks, and it's a tough spot for us, but we feel it's very important that as stewards of your resource, that we have to do something is not acceptable, and we're doing what the public has told us they want us to do. They would like us to do something to address CWD. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the public survey we did. But again, we hear you, we understand, we don't have all the answers, but we've got to do something to make sure that the surveyed population in Wyoming maintains what it is today and into the future. And again, by doing nothing with regards to CWD, it could have significant outcomes that 5-10 years from now may not be acceptable. So we ask that as we go through this tonight, realize we hear you, we understand where you're coming from, but please read the plan, base your comments on what you think the plan says or what it should say, and we're looking for some real good, meaningful interchange tonight. So some additional things, we are governed by a commission. Ralph Brokaw is one of the 7 members of the commission. The commission, well over a year ago, has asked us or charged us to explore measures to reduce CWD prevalence in Wyoming ungulates herds. So based on that commission's direction, again, on what the public has asked us to do, we feel it's important that we do move forward with that. We just can't sweep it under the rug. And then we've also asked that with your participation, we have drafted the plan. The department leadership and the commission are the final decision makers. It'll be the department plan, and as such, we will evaluate all the comments and ideas, etc., that are presented, and those will be evaluated, and then those will be put in the plan as approved by the leadership, and then ultimately by the commission in either March or April of this year. And whatever decisions made, we will monitor that. We will monitor what works and doesn't work to achieve this objective. But again, as I've said several times, we can't do this without you and your participation, your ideas, and your support and your engagement. So again, this is your wildlife resource, but we really need your help in addressing CWD across the state in order to sustain cervix on the landscape. Jess, are you ready?
I am.
So I'm going to introduce Dr. Jessica Western. Jessica has kind of been a mentor, leader through this collaborative process. She's worked with the department on several projects over the last several years, and she's been a great help and assistance in this project. So with that, Jess, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the collaborative process.
All right, thank you so much. I'm Jessica Western. I'm with the Ruckelshaus Institute at the Haupt School of Environment and Natural Resources here at our wonderful University of Wyoming. And I have been working with Game and Fish on this project since April last year. And so my job is to help them design a process, help them implement this collaborative public engagement process. And if you're interested in finding out what the process has been looking like in detail so far, we have published an interim report, and it's up on the Game and Fish website, and I think it's also on the Ruckelshaus Institute website. So one thing I wanted to say, it's very clear that there are a lot of questions about this, and this is of high importance to people in Wyoming, understandably. So don't wait until the end of presentations if you have questions or thoughts. Share it with us, please, immediately. Just put up your hand. We'd love to hear from you. We want this to be more interactive. And I have this flip chart up here because ultimately the purpose of tonight is to find out from what you know about the plan, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at it, maybe even read the whole darn thing, because it's long. Find out from you whether you have any suggestions for Game and Fish, and especially for the working group to consider. So if there are things in it that you think, meh, I don't think that goes far enough, or meh, I think that goes too far, if you have another suggestion, we would love to hear them, and I'll put them up here, okay? So some of this is a little repetitive from what I presented the first time around back in June. So CWD is prevalent almost across all of Wyoming. This is why the commission has told Game and Fish to get to work on this. It affects all cervix, whitetail, mule deer, elk, and moose. And it's a typical wicked situation. And by wicked, we mean it's very complex. You know, it's like this ball of string, and if you pull on one string, the whole darn thing comes with it. It's very integrated and complex, and it's also very contentious. And it's a subject of high concern. So the purpose of this process is to explore CWD scientific information and public input, to evaluate management options, to minimize CWD in Wyoming cervid populations. The whole purpose of this process is to explore ways for Game and Fish to reduce the prevalence of CWD. The working group will create recommendations, which they have, to the department for incorporation into a revised CWD management plan. And this is version 3 that they're working on now. And that's the one we're talking about tonight, based on meaningful public input and science. What the working group has created so far are draft recommendations. The final recommendations they're going to be working on in February. So this is the process. So first there was an internal meeting within Game and Fish, because within Game and Fish there are a lot of questions and uncertainties, and they needed to be able to get on the same page, at least about what this process is. Secondly, we had public workshops. Some of you may have been there the last time around in May and June. And there we put everybody into breakout groups and asked them, what are the subjects that you want the working group to consider? What do you want them to talk about? And what kind of solutions do you have in mind? So we put all those together in a spreadsheet and presented it to the working group. So the working group worked directly off of what they heard from the public, not from Game and Fish, from the public. Based on what they heard from the public, they went through 3 two-day meetings, and they had to go through a lot of technical, scientific, complex information and deliberate that between these 32 individuals who each represent different stakeholders. So you have very different opinions on this working group, and very different levels of knowledge, very different interests. They came together and worked on the suggestions that they got from the public, and from there, They drafted a whole list of, I think it was a total of something like 54 draft recommendations that they came up with. 40 of them got full consensus. 7 of them, there were major reservations with them. 7 of them got no consensus. So it's pretty amazing. You get 32 very different people in the room. They found consensus on 40 points. And every word in all those draft recommendations were thoroughly deliberated. Again, it took days and days. It was hard work for them. Based on those draft recommendations, Game of Fish has drafted this plan. So this draft plan is tied back directly to what they heard from the public, okay? And that's important because that's why they invested all this time, all these people, all their time and money into this public process, so that it's not based on ivory tower, if you will, in Cheyenne. It's based on public input. Because they need buy-in. This is a scary subject for all of you. So now we're going through the third phase, which is presenting this draft plan back to you and find out what do you think of the recommendations and what suggestions do you have for changing things. And please also tell Game of Fish what you do like. That's just as important as finding out what they don't like, because otherwise, if they don't find out what you do like, then they don't really know where they stand. And then in February, they're going to get together with the working group. The working group is going to get together. I'm compiling this information that I put on these flip charts. I'm compiling that, and I will present what you give me. I'm going to present that to the working group for them to consider in finalizing those recommendations. So those are going to be the final recommendations in February, and those are going to go to the commission. Okay. Any questions about this? Any confusion? Okay. So 146 people attended the 5 workshops that we held in the first set of workshops. In the first public meetings, participants worked to answer the question, what ideas would you like the CWD working group to consider in developing management options for CWD in Wyoming? One thing that's important, I just want to hook back into something that Scott said. From the very beginning, it was very clear to the working group that what might work in Wheatland may not necessarily work in Sheridan. There are different situations in different places. So what the managers and their constituents need is basically a menu of options for them to be able to use, that based on all this hard work from the public and from scientists, they needed a set of options that are good options to consider in that place. Okay, so they're probably not going to be using everything that's in that plan, because some of those things might not be applicable in Wheatland or in Brad's neck of the woods. So the working group received, the public, you all came up with 273 management options. So I put that into a chart, and that too is up on the website, and I categorized it by topics. And I wound up categorizing these 273 options into 50 categories. So it was very broad, it was very in-depth. You have a lot of knowledge. And they saw that loud and clear. So the working group created 54 draft recommendations. All the language that they went through was created and vetted by the working group. I mean, down to the and the in and the everything. The results were 40 consensus recommendations, 7 recommendations that received consensus with major reservations, which is still a consensus. But if people had 5, if they put up 5 fingers, that meant no, I don't like it. And we only need one person to say no, I don't like it, and if we can't change their mind, then it goes into the document as a recommendation without consensus, which 7 of them did. So some factors to bear in mind. The purpose of this process is to learn from you and from the working group for Game of Fish. Ultimately, if CWD is going to be effectively managed, Game and Fish needs to be able to experiment. Well, you're not going to let them experiment without understanding how and why and where, rightly so. So they wanted to be able to share their information with you and get information back. Experimentation and implementation is likely going to be a long-term proposition. In return, Game and Fish wants to be able to learn what they can and cannot do and why. They want to be able to share that with you. The recommendations that result are being taken, by now it's in the present tense, serious consideration. And they looked at whether they can adopt the recommendations they got from the working group, but based within certain criteria, like what's their budget, how much staffing do they have, all those sorts of things. And then there's science. This was another complication for the working group, is there are wildly different sets of science. So which science do they base decisions on? So they also had to come up with recommendations to Game and Fish based on conflicting science sometimes. And then access to process. If there's anyone who wanted to attend this workshop tonight, again, it's being filmed and it's going to be posted up on the Game and Fish website if people want to look at it later. So the objectives for this workshop is to learn the outcomes of the process so far, including the draft recommendations, and you're going to get a lot of information from that, from the working group, or not the working group, from the team tonight. Learn what is in the resulting Game and Fish CWD plan, discuss management options described in the plan, answer your questions, and get your suggestions for submission to the working group, and then discuss next steps. So tonight we've had our welcome from Scott. I'm about to shut up. Scott is going to talk about how the working group's recommendations are included in the draft plan. Hank is going to talk about CWD, surveillance and monitoring. Justin is going to talk about disease management and other topics, and then Brad is going to go into feed grounds, and I'll make sure you get out of here by 9 o'clock. The ground rules for tonight. This is a collaborative process about chronic wasting disease generally across the whole state. That's another thing to consider. The working group has had to really think about CWD as a whole all over the state. That's why they're creating options and not saying this is what you need to do there and this is what you need to do there. So it's about the whole state. All participants have an interest in the cervid herds of Wyoming, so we will use respectful behavior to all. It's okay to disagree. If you disagree with Game and Fish or anyone else, that's great. We want to hear it, and we want to know why. That's going to be really helpful. So we will seek to understand while seeking to be understood. Participants will contribute to making this a successful collaborative learning opportunity. Don't interrupt others, don't dominate, and please do not withhold information. We'd really love to hear from you. Please be constructive. Discuss less what does not work and more what does work. Side conversations are disruptive. If possible, turn off cell phones. Otherwise, please take the call outside. Any disagreement with these ground rules? All right, that's all I have. Any questions for me as the facilitator? All right. Okay, Scott?
All right, so how did the department get from the stuff that Jessica just talked about, the working group recommendations, to what's in the actual plan? So it was actually a pretty simple process, so to speak. How that occurred was myself as the deputy chief, Doug Brimmeyer, who's sitting in the back, who is my counterpart as the other deputy chief in wildlife, and our chief game warden, chief of wildlife division, Rick King, along with Hank Edwards, Janet Millick, and Justin Bidfit, individuals that introduced themselves here earlier. Met with Brian Nesbitt, our director, Angie Bruce, one deputy director, and John Kennedy, our other deputy director, and we sat down for half a day and went literally line by line of the working group recommendations, and we evaluated, discussed, talked about which one of these recommendations, all of these recommendations are realistic and feasible, and based on those discussions, the draft plan you see before me is what is a result of that discussion. As Jessica mentioned, due to the diligent work of the working group, most of those recommendations were adopted by the department because we see those as something that we feel that we can implement in a reasonable and responsible manner both fiscally on the ground and do what's best for the served populations within Wyoming to address CWD. So basically it was a pretty simple process. There wasn't a lot of smoke and mirrors, just open, honest communications and discussions. We gave a lot of background on the recommendations and the discussions that went on during the working group meeting, so they had a little bit of background, and at the end of the day, again, what you see before you is what was decided on from the highest levels leadership of the department. So that's kind of how it went. Any questions on that?
Yeah, any questions for Scott on how Game and Fish took the recommendations from the working group and translated it into a plan, their process? Okay, all right.
Okay, with that, we'll start with our first presentation. Hank Edwards, as Hank said, he is the supervisor of the Wildlife Health Lab here in Laramie, across the street at the Wildlife, at the veterinary lab. We have a health lab in there. So with that, Hank, I'll turn it over to you.
So to start from the beginning, this is a short presentation, about 20 slides. It's really just a basic 101 of CWD. So the working group had about a day and a half of education on CWD, and I crammed that into about 20 slides. So this is just the high points, just the high points. It's much more complicated than these 20 slides for sure. So to start off with, what is it? Chronic wasting disease is a progressive fatal nervous system disease. White-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose, reindeer. You don't see this disease going to pronghorn, or bighorn sheep, or livestock. It's pretty restricted to these stories. Causative agent is a prion, or an infectious protein, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But this is not a Wyoming problem, right? This is a problem that's much larger than Wyoming. This disease is now found in 26 of our states, also in Canada, Norway, Finland, South Korea, and Sweden. So this is a worldwide problem. It's getting more and more of a problem. So back to a prion. What exactly is a prion? Well, all of our cells have that normal prion that you see to the left. What happens is the abnormal prion, or the prion that causes CWD, is just shaped a little bit differently. And it's that shape that causes a disease. And the way the disease replicates, if you will, in the body is when this protein comes in contact with a normal protein, it forces it to take on its abnormal form. So when these proteins are folded up like this, they're incredibly resistant. They're resistant to the body's normal proteases that gets rid of it, resistant to disinfectants, all the normal things that we think of to combat disease. Let's say if it's a bacteria or a virus, whether it be a vaccine or be an antibiotic or even a disinfectant. In this shape, they're incredibly resistant. It's kind of hard to get your mind wrapped around that just a different shape makes it so different. But anyway, because of this different shape, the body has a hard time getting rid of them. So they accumulate. And as they accumulate, they form fibrils, and those fibrils eventually cause the death of cells in the central nervous system. And as those more and more cells die, then animals start to take on the classic signs of CWD that you think of, like weight loss, drooling, behavioral changes, hair coat changes, droopy ears, lack of general awareness, right? The lights are on, but nobody's home. But I think it's really important to note that they don't get to these end stages of the disease until the last, say, 6 to 8 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks. They can have the disease for at least a year and a half prior to coming down with these signs. So that's the biggest surprise for hunters, is when their animal comes back positive and it was a nice, healthy, fat animal. So these animals will still test very strong positive on our tests at the lab and be in very good body condition. So don't think that they have to get these end stages to have CWD. So we know that CWD prions can be shed for months, if not years, before an animal shows signs of the disease. And we know that CWD is transmitted both animal to animal as well as environment to animal. animals. So when animals come in contact with contaminated soil or plants, fences, feeders, troughs, mineral licks, tubs, and even carcasses can serve as a reservoir for these animals. When they come in contact with it, they too can contract that disease. And two, we know that, at least with scrapie, these prions can remain in the environment for at least 16 years. We don't have good data on CWD, of course, but because it's caused by a similar disease as scrapie, we assume that that persistence is probably at least as long.
Scrapie's a one-time sheep, right?
Correct. As far as sex, age, and CWD, we know that CWD prevalence is higher in bucks than it is in does, and we know that CWD prevalence is higher in prime age bucks than it is in yearlings and, say, fawnings. We don't see that differences in elk, that both males and females tend to have about the same prevalence, but again, we do see a higher prevalence in those older age animals as opposed to, again, calves and yearlings. So far, we found no true genetic resistance to CWD, although genetics can influence the length of the incubation period from the time an animal is infected until they come down with the disease. As far as predators are concerned, we know that mountain lions selectively prey on CWD-infected animals, and modeling suggests that wolf predation is likely to decrease prevalence as well. As far as CWD in human health, there's been a number of laboratory studies, and so far it seems to have a pretty substantial species barrier, but that barrier is probably not absolute. There's an ongoing study where they have fed macaques meat from infected deer, and those macaques did come down with a CWD-like illness, but this study is not complete, and nor is it published yet. To date, there's been no indication of this disease going to humans. The public health and CDC monitors causes of death in those states where CWD is prevalent, and there's no indication it goes to humans. That said, the CDC and the World Health Organization both recommend that CWD positive animals not be consumed. And that's because the prion is not inactivated by cooking, like many of the other bacteria or viruses, and it's probably just prudent to minimize exposure to prions. I think if many of you were here at the earlier meeting, I said if you wanted to inactivate the prion, one thing you could do would be to soak your instruments in 50% bleach for an hour. New information has come out this fall that says 40% bleach for at least 5 minutes is effective at deactivating the prion. That's good news. Maybe a little less rust on our butchering equipment. As far as CWD in Wyoming is concerned, we really don't know when this disease was established within the state, but some of the modeling suggests it's probably been here since the 50s. We didn't document it in free-ranging mule deer until 1985, elk in 86, white-tailed deer in 90, and we've only documented it in one moose, and that was over on the far western edge of the state, and that was in 2008. This is a heat map of the distribution of CWD. So I've got two maps to show you. This early one is 1998 until 2005. So as you would imagine, the darker the color, the more dense the positives are. So this is not a prevalence map, although prevalence would have an effect on, of course, the number of positives. But this positive here in the southeastern corner of the state, that's probably more related to the fact that for several years, in the early years, this is really where our surveillance was focused, only in the southeastern corner. And not until 2003, 2004, and even 2005 did we really do a good job of surveying the state. And over the course of those 3 years, I think we almost got 14,000 samples from across the state. And after that, after those first 3 years, I think we had a pretty good idea where the disease occurred. Again, southeastern corner, obviously, seeing a little bit south of the Black Hills, Bighorn Basin, got a few positives there, and north of the Bighorns. So this is a map of what it is from 2006 until present. And as you can see, our surveillance changed a little bit. We're doing more statewide surveillance. And we're documenting a lot of CWD, of course, in the southeastern corner. This is Platte Valley. This is Baggs. You can see there's quite a bit. Black Hills has got a little bit, as does a significant amount in the Bighorn Basin. This is new this year, right here around Pavilion. We found pretty high prevalences there, as well as eastern side of the Bighorns. So keep in mind, again, this is just a heat map showing where we have identified positives. So over the course of time, from when we began our surveillance to now, we've examined over 68,000 samples. And but also keep in mind that we only test about 8% of the harvest. So this certainly isn't all the CWD, but this is what we documented. So as I mentioned, CWD is more prevalent in bucks, and in those hunt areas where we have had prevalence for quite some time, we noticed that there's fewer class 2 bucks, which is an antler spread of 20 to 25 inches, and class 3 bucks, which is 25 inches and above. This makes sense. So here's some of our highest prevalence areas. As you can see, there's fewer of those bucks. But it's not just bucks, it's also does. In a survival study in the South Converse mule deer herd, you see that CWD positive females had a 37% chance of making it year to year. I think it's important to note here, though, that CWD is just one factor that affects a deer herd. There's many, many, many factors that determine how well a deer herd is going to do in the face of CWD. And although this line looks like as CWD went up, that it's a causative effect that the population went down, then actually there's a lot of drought and a lot of other factors that affected this drop in the population. I think just one brief slide on elk, in that we do not see CWD as widespread in our elk populations, nor do we see the prevalence levels in our elk that we do in our deer. We do have a fairly high prevalence here in Hunt Area 6. It's around 12 to 14%, but most areas like 7 where it's been established for quite some time, it stays right around 5%. As far as CWD and what you can do, I think obviously this disease is not going anywhere, and for those of you who really like to hunt, I think maybe consider modifying some of your practices. It sounds pretty obvious, but don't harvest animals that appear unusually thin or obviously sick, right? Maybe hold that animal in scope just a little bit longer and take a better assessment of its body condition. Wear rubber gloves or latex gloves when you're field dressing. It's just a good idea for a lot of reasons. And finally, test before processing or consumption. If this is something you're very concerned about, and consider quartering and freezing your animal until you get those test results back. Help us by limiting environmental contamination and sources of infection. Proper disposal of carcasses and parts helps, as well as reporting animals that are showing signs of CWD to Wyoming Game and Fish, so that those animals can be removed from the landscape. Finally, keep an open mind and patience for CWD management actions. Again, we're not going to be able to eradicate this disease, but management may be possible and it's worth a shot. But it's going to be a long-term commitment. Results may not be detectable for 5 or maybe even 10 years. Getting back to carcass disposal, I put this up here because many people aren't aware that the Game and Fish several years ago passed carcass transport regulations. And it basically says that the head and spinal column needs to remain at the site of the kill, or if you bring it to back home, that it needs to be disposed of in an approved landfill or an approved incinerator. And whole deer and elk carcasses, moose carcasses, cannot be transported out of the state. So hunters are just starting to figure this out and be aware of our regulations. So we're really trying to do a public education campaign on this. And the same is true for bringing animals into the state if they were harvested in areas where CWD occurs. Any questions I can ask before I move on to surveillance? Connie?
Just a couple of quick questions, Hank. One was, you mentioned that the prevalence is more common in males than females in mule deer at any rate. How much more common?
It varies on the hunt area. So as CWD remains in an area for a long period of time and that prevalence increases, we see that the prevalence in females also slowly starts to increase. Initially, what would you say, Mary, it's over twice? Yeah, right around twice what it is in males as opposed to females.
And so does that converge then? Is that what you're saying, as prevalence increases? The distinction between, or the
I don't know that we have any areas, because unfortunately we just don't harvest a lot of females in the state. And I don't know that we see that where those prevalences female prevalences have met male prevalences. It may be true in whitetail deer up in the northern part of the state. I'd have to look at my stats to confirm that. But we certainly have elevated prevalence in does in whitetails.
And then I was also just curious on the moose. You said you only have one documented case of a moose. How much surveillance do you do on moose? How often do people get their moose tested, hunters?
I'm sorry, I don't have those figures right
Well,
with me,
just
but actually
roughly.
we have quite a few moose. We've looked at, I don't know how many exactly, but actually we do sample quite a few moose every year, somewhere between 50 and 100 a year. I can give you more exact numbers.
Yeah, that's okay. I just was curious to know
Yep.
roughly.
Actually, that moose that was from the western edge of the state was a targeted moose. We say targeted, that means it was showing signs of CWD, and that was sampled by one of our agency personnel.
Hank, I think I
Rather than
remember
hunting
from our, at
harvest.
least as far as surveillance goes over time, that I think you've tested somewhere over 1,200 moose.
Over time, yes.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised at that.
Thanks. Are there questions for Hank? Yeah, go for it.
They had in area of 11 for elk this year, up above Arlington there, on the county road. There was a large box and table set up on the edge of the road with instructions on leaving the head and how to, preserve it and all that stuff. I was just curious if you have found anything, heard anything from that scenario, or, did you have more set up elsewhere, or what?
I'll let the Laramie folks talk about that.
So we had Boardville.
Hey,
Oh, sorry. So we had a head box at the office in case people showed up after hours. We had a head box on Forest Service 101, like I said, in 11, and then 111, and then one in Saratoga. Two in Saratoga. Some were more successful than others, like the total amount of heads received, I'm not sure. Some worked better than others. The one by the Wick on the 101 road seemed fairly successful. Do you know, Emily, how many heads?
I don't know how many heads, but the Arlington one was probably the most successful one we had.
Yeah, enough to be that it was worth it, and especially in areas that it's hard for us to be there all the time, and it's a limited quota area. It was just another tool that we used to try to collect samples. So the Snorri Range was a targeted area for elk and deer on this side of the state to increase sample size for rank, and so that's why we're using those head boxes.
Is that going to be a very accurate representation? I mean, if I shoot a buck or a bull, I'm not giving you the head. If I shoot a cow or a bull.
Yes, so we did provide saws to be able to cut the antlers off if people wanted to take those. We also get a lot of people showing up at the office so after they take it to the taxidermy and get it caped out and come back and try to get samples. It is harder to get those trophy aged animals to get samples just because of that factor.
what's the main part of the head you're looking for?
Basically 2 inches below the jawline. It's the retropharyngeal lymph nodes. They're the same ones that you feel when you get sick.
And there's a little video on your website, right? On how to remove those.
So is it possible instead of dropping the head and just cut those glands out and drop them in a Ziploc baggie?
Yeah, we've been working with that. Like we worked with backcountry hunters and anglers, wanted us to go to one of their meetings and show how to take those. We did that, and we've been showing hunters at the check stations people are getting more interested in it. So we've been helping people figure it out. So we have been getting more samples that way, which is much appreciated. Your first time, I'd be very cautious about not bringing in the head. I've gotten some weird tissues. I think the first time, bring in the lymph nodes and the head, so if you didn't get them right, then we can show you the correct way.
Right. Yeah, if you're gonna take them out yourself, hold the head till you hear back from us, for sure. And some people do retrieve the head from their taxidermist and then bring that in for us to sample. Because usually the glands are still there. The taxidermist doesn't remove these. All right, if there's no more questions, I'll burn through surveillance. Sir.
On your testing on the elk, are you doing both the ovics and the retropharyngeal?
We are not doing both. We are only doing the retropharyngeal.
I'm sure you're aware of the papers that speak of the elk called gold standard, or the only accurate is the ovics.
I don't think it's only the obex.
It's preferred.
Yeah, it's preferred to do both the retro and the obex. And I'll go over some of this in my presentation today on surveillance. But you are correct that if you want to get every single infection, you do just that. You test both tissues, because it's known that in the very, very early stages of the disease, the prions will show up in the retropharyngeals first, 90% of the time, thereabouts, and in the obex, about 10% of the time.
I think at first it's in the deer. It's my understanding from the papers that it shows first in the deer, but the elk, the ovics is the gold standard.
I'd be interested in reading that paper. I'm not familiar with that. We can talk about it later if you'd like. Any other questions before I move on to surveillance? Okay, so this is a short presentation. It's only about 8 or 9 slides. CWD testing is very federally regulated, and right now within the state of Wyoming, there's only 2 labs that are approved to test, and that's, of course, our Wyoming Game and Fish Lab, as well as the Wyoming State Veterinary Laboratory. We do one test, they do another test. We don't duplicate our testing. Diagnostic tissues are the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, as you just mentioned, as well as the obex or the brainstem, as you just mentioned. We have a capacity of between 200 and 300 samples per day, and that's about 5 lab rats working to process those tissues. It costs us about $32 for each test. That includes the cost of the test itself, as well as consumables, and of course our laboratory help that helps us crank through those. We do our best to get those results out back to the hunter within less than 3 weeks. All the results are, of course, available on our Wyoming Game and Fish website, and each hunter who's unfortunate enough to harvest a CWD positive animal gets a Hank letter, either in the mail or through an email. Our testing capacity overall is about 15,000 samples per year, and that's what we can handle with our current infrastructure and laboratory space that we have. One of the most common recommendations that we heard through all of our public meetings was that we really needed to increase our testing speed and get those results back out to the hunters in a shorter time frame. We have made quite a few changes in our laboratory. One of the things we did was move our processing over to this building, and our testing is across the road. But actually it's helped us quite a bit. We can crank through those samples usually in less than a week, actually usually in about 3 days. The problem is getting the sample from the field, whether it be Cody or Sheridan or wherever, to the lab. And that's one thing we probably need to work on to to try and increase those, or decrease the time it takes to ship those samples down without, of course, running up a huge FedEx bill. One of the things that was brought up in several public meetings, of course, was set up additional testing laboratories across the state. We can do that, but it's really expensive to meet those federal requirements that come along with CWD testing, as well as the personnel it would take to staff those. Not that we're saying we're not gonna do it, it's just, it's very expensive to do. Right now, all funding for CWD testing and monitoring is funded through our departmental budget. And, but if we start to do a lot more monitoring or look at different ways to test, we would certainly seek outside funding sources where they were possible. Now, moving on to our CWD surveillance plan. You know, for the last 20 some odd years, we've really focused only on this leading edge. That's where we put most of our efforts, because our goal was to inform the hunters where CWD occurs and where it doesn't, so they could make an informed decision on where to hunt. Not that we didn't walk away from this part of the state, we didn't at all. We continued to monitor different populations that we knew CWD was in, but really our focus was here. And like I said, over the course of that time, we've looked at over 68,000 samples across the state. But it was really a shotgun approach. It wasn't very focused. So we're changing the focus of our surveillance from more of a detection to a monitoring, so we can continue to monitor many of these populations. Of course, our goal here is to get a better understanding of the population of population impacts of this disease, as well as evaluate any future management actions we may be able to employ. So we've adopted a 5-year rotational strategy, and every year we're going to concentrate on between 9 and 11 both deer and elk herd units combined across the state each year. This is a good balance that we'll be able to balance both what we can do in the field, what we can do in the laboratory, as well as meeting our disease surveillance requirements. We built kind of a robust adaptive monitoring program where we're really going to focus on getting good statistically significant sample sizes in our herd units, as well as harvest mapping of each one of those kill locations so that we can determine how good we're doing as far as sample distribution across the herd unit, as well as identification of CWD hotspots. Because this disease doesn't occur uniformly across the landscape, certainly hotspots that we'd like to be able to identify. So our surveillance is going to shift and be concentrated only on hunter-killed male mule deer, as well as adult elk, both male and female, of course. So we went through, evaluated all of our herd units, and determined how easy they were to sample, how much harvest is there, how much access, all of those things, and then graded them as to how quickly we could get samples. Can we get 200 samples in a year, 2 years, 3 years? And there's actually some herd units where we just don't harvest a tremendous number of critters, so those are going to be opportunistic. We'll just get samples whenever we can. Not that we're not going to concentrate on whitetail deer, because certainly in the northern part of the state and down here in the southeastern as well, there's some areas where CWD is very prevalent in whitetails, and we continue to monitor those. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Connie, continue to opportunistically sample moose. For those hunters who don't happen to fall within those 9 to 11 herd units we concentrate on, or if they just don't get their animal sampled within one of those focus areas, continue to make CWD sampling available to all of our regional offices, and that is at no charge. So, in those areas where we have not detected CWD, we're not going to walk away from that by any means. It'll also be included in the 5-year rotation. We'll continue to sample that, but each year we'll collect both road-killed and targeted animals in those areas, because we know that animals with CWD are more likely to get chrome and rubber disease, right? They're more likely to be hit by a car. And we know that targeted animals, again, those that are showing signs of CWD, are more likely to have CWD. So those just basically turn into a point system. So we know that a targeted female, targeted male is worth X amount of points, and we shoot to make 230 points in each of those herd units for 90% confidence, or a whopping 300 points for 95% confidence that the disease does not occur within that set area. That's all I have on surveillance. Questions?
Where does the funding come from for testing?
All of it is funded through the department. All of it is.
Other questions for Hank?
Did you?
I was just curious if there was any way we could boost funding through increased license costs or other.
Yeah, get
There's
our
a
state
commissioner sitting right
legislature
next to you.
to allow some of the money
Right.
from the lottery to be put in.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, it's very expensive to monitor this disease. Because that $32 is just the lab costs. What it costs with all the technicians and everybody out in the field to collect it, it's expensive. It really is. Bumps up on the cost of a
Well,
license.
right, and if we can increase license fees $1 or $2, then we'd probably have another lab in Cody.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
Any other questions for Hank?
Just real quick on the fees, there's been some talk at the national level, and many of you know that Brian Ezrick, our director, just testified in front of Congress last week on CWD and trying to get some national level engagement. And there's also a bill that was discussed in appropriations of getting some funding for CWD back to the states and as well as the national level. So keep our fingers crossed that maybe we get some federal partnerships and federal dollars to work on this disease. Whether it come right back to us with regards to sampling or whatever, that's unknown. But if we can get some federal dollars, it would free up some dollars for other things. So keep your fingers crossed. And Senator Barrasso is kind of championing the bill through his committee, the EPW committee, on getting a national task force to start looking at CWD.
So now we'll get kind of into the meat of the plan. What are the actual disease management strategies that we've outlined in this plan? So these strategies kind of take on three primary categories. We have addressing artificial sources of deer concentration, well, cervid concentration, I should say. Using hunter-harvest management as a tool to reduce CWD prevalence, or at least maintain it. And then some additional agency and regulatory actions, many of which we're kind of already doing. So with all this, the strategies that we're going to employ are going to be revolving around what we call adaptive management. Adaptive management is kind of just an agency buzzword that says we're going to take a systematic approach at learning from the outcomes of our management strategies over time. And so we're going to strategically apply these strategies, and we're going to evaluate them, and they're going to be based on the best available science we have. It's going to be a scientific approach. We'll use, in a lot of cases, we're going to use what we call a VACI design, which is just saying it's a before-after control impact experimental design. So with that, these actions that we're talking about, they're going to be based on the best available data, science, and the accepted wildlife management practices that we already employ. A lot of these management strategies may be experimental in nature. Some of these, there's some unknowns with some of this, in terms of how effective they're going to be. And that's going to require really a lot of need for public input and support. It's really going to be reliant upon developing these strategies in conjunction with you, the public. If we don't have public support for implementing some of these strategies, we're probably not going to get anywhere. And these strategies are probably going to have to be implemented over a very long term. The progression of this disease is such, it's a very slow-moving disease. In terms of the way the disease runs its course through populations, and then populations replace themselves generationally. If you're going to evaluate or detect any changes in prevalence from an action, it's going to have to be over a very long time frame. So, to start with, artificial sources of concentration. So, high concentrations of cervids can certainly facilitate disease transmission. This is certainly an extreme example here. Of some folks feeding whitetails, but when you have high concentrations of cervids, it can increase animal-to-animal contact and therefore disease transmission. That's the case with all diseases. In the case of CWD though, you also can have increased environmental contamination. So like Hank said, you can get prion accumulation in the environment. And so when we concentrate these animals in the same area over a prolonged period of time, you have much more environmental contamination and therefore more disease transmission. So what are some of the common sources of these? You know, certainly within urban places and municipalities, we get green spaces like golf courses or parks or things like that. Those can concentrate deer. A pretty common form of concentrating cervids can be through the intentional feeding by private citizens. That happens actually in municipalities all over the state. And then we have agricultural operations. Agricultural operations are probably the most common form of cervid concentration in the state. Now that's not to say I'm picking on agriculture, because I'm not. Most of these ag practices we're talking about are actually very beneficial to cervids in a lot of cases, in the absence of disease, whether it's irrigated hay meadows, hay stacks, things like that. And so in these cases, you know, they're providing, you know, these agricultural operations are providing food, water, cover, just a lot of the basic life history requirements for our wildlife. So what are some of the things that we're going to do to address that? Well, we'd like to engage the agricultural community and work really with willing landowners to explore some of these things, like potentially decreasing cervid concentrations through hunting seasons, or even culling if we had to. In some of these places where we concentrate, where we find disease in a pretty focused area. For example, Martin Hicks was telling me about a place by Wheatland, where he routinely gets 4 or 5 CWD positive deer out of the same hay corral every single year. So that's something that's probably worth us taking a look at and trying to mitigate that risk. Making those sources unavailable to those cervids. So maybe fencing a stack yard, or developing some, you know, we're looking at maybe an experimental study where we're going to look at using some salt and mineral feeders where livestock can be trained to access those mineral licks, but excludes deer and elk and things like that. And so looking at employing some of these strategies, but also without impacting normal agricultural operations, right? Because we're not going to get anywhere otherwise. But it's really engaging those landowners just to see what we can do. In a lot of cases it may be nothing, but in some cases maybe there's some low-hanging fruit that we can address. And then also developing just some informational material on some of the good practices that maybe willing landowners could try to employ. So like I talked about, you know, mineral licks are certainly a place where cervids concentrate. We're already starting the process of a pilot study that will kick off this next spring. We're going to be working with the USGS and the University of Wyoming here, and we've got a landowner south of Douglas that I think we're going to start this on, where we're going to assess how many deer are using these salt licks, and then put these livestock or these deer exclusionary feeders on there, and then seeing how deer behave otherwise, and also what the learning curve is for his livestock. We're assessing things like the value of water developments. Sometimes we're putting guzzlers out in places. Well, maybe we need to reassess that in some places where you can have prion loading in the environment. Another thing that we'd like to do is work with the legislature and local governments to the extent possible. And that's to pursue some bans of intentional private feeding of cervids. It happens all over the place. Excuse me, I got a cold. And then where we would pursue these, we would exclude traditional ag practices. And then I also realized that anytime we talk about artificially concentrating cervids, elk feed grounds are a big issue, and we're actually going to address those later. One of the other things we'd like to do is just continue our business as usual, is pursuing wildlife habitat improvement projects across the state. Anytime we can improve wildlife habitats, it can boost the nutritional condition of our animals. It can help herds buffer against other factors that may be causing impacts to those herds, such as predation, things like that, disease. So anytime we can improve landscapes over a large scale, our wildlife populations are going to benefit. So now with hunter harvest management, this is kind of really one of the big ones. So here, the department, the intention is the department will identify either herd units, hunt areas, or portions of hunt areas or subpopulations to develop some hunting season strategies to reduce or limit CWD prevalence. So like Hank talked about, mature males typically have a much higher prevalence of CWD than females. And older age class males have a much higher prevalence than younger age class males. So we may be looking to increase male harvest in some places. We may be looking to reduce some populations or cervid densities in areas of concern. And then we may also be looking at strategies to reduce or remove deer in areas that we kind of call hot spots, kind of like the example we talked about. And if we're going to implement these strategies, again, it's going to have to be over a very long time frame. If we're going to adequately be able to evaluate the effects of this strategy on these herds, we're talking in some cases maybe 5 years, maybe even 10 years or more. So if we're going to increase mature male harvest in some areas, where are we going to do it? Well, that's a good question. In a lot of cases, we certainly haven't figured that out yet. It's going to have to be based on a lot of things. But the ways in which we would do it would probably be just through our traditional season structures, like increasing license issuance, or in the case of a general license area, maybe extending season length. We may also consider altering the timing of our seasons, earlier or later, to focus that harvest pressure more on mature bucks. So there's strategies, well, I shouldn't say strategy, but one of the things that's been noticed in Colorado, the way Colorado hunts their deer is they actually have 3 seasons. I don't know, some of you guys might not be able to see this, but this is second half of October, first half of November, and second half of November. So they call it first, second, and third season. And in these cases, as what they're starting to notice in some of these game management units, is that they're harvesting higher percentages of CWD positive deer later in the season. And theoretically being those prime age bucks are just more vulnerable to harvest that. So this is kind of what they're seeing in some of those areas, is here the black line basically is third season license issuance. And is what they're seeing in some areas where third season license issuance has gone up, CWD prevalence has gone down. Here's a case where third season license issuance actually decreased, and you'll see, it's not saying that's what's causing CWD prevalence to go up, but it's certainly maybe playing a role in allowing this prevalence to continue to climb. And a similar situation over here where CWD prevalence has kind of stayed fairly stagnant, although with some slight increases with higher rates of harvest later in the season. And the important take-home point on all this is that in these cases, they're actually managing their buck ratios pretty consistently with how they've done it in the past. In these herds, these 2 herds we're talking about, their buck ratios are still post-season 39 and 40 bucks per 100 does in those 2 herds, and both populations are still above their management objective levels. So what does that mean for Wyoming? Not really sure yet, but I put this up here just to kind of show you guys. This is a statewide map of our mule deer buck ratios, and it's from 2014 to 2018. And so they're 5-year average buck ratios. And I'm just putting this up here to demonstrate the fact that by and large in Wyoming, we manage for pretty darn high buck ratios in our mule deer herds. You'll see that we have 7 of our herds right now, have buck ratios between 20 and 29 bucks per 100 does, 15 between 30 and 39 bucks per 100 does, 11 from between 40 and 49, and then 1 herd where the 5-year average is even over 50 bucks per 100 does. Now, not in every case does this always mean we have a ton of bucks. These are ratios. So sometimes you can also have a really high buck ratio, but your population is still way below objective. But it's just something that we need to evaluate and look at. So kind of bear that in mind. So another hunter harvest management strategy is to reduce populations and densities within areas of concern. This could be done at a big herd unit level. Most likely the case that we're talking about is probably going to be within a subpopulation or a segment of a population. And there's a lot of factors that we have to consider here. Where is this population relative to the carrying capacity of the landscape? How many deer can this landscape support? Where it is relative to our commission-defined population objective. Is it way above objective, at objective, way below objective? But I guess, you know, a take-home message here is, in areas where we are going to do this, just to be transparent about the whole thing, it would require sustained female harvest. And harvesting female mule deer is not a popular notion in the majority of the state of Wyoming right now, because we're all concerned about our deer herds, and I don't know anybody that doesn't want to see more mule deer for the most part. So I put these maps up here though to illustrate a little bit of a difference, but just to maybe give you a feel for what I'm talking about. This is a hunt area over by Worland, hunt area 164 southwest of Worland. And you'll notice in this hunt area that the vast majority of the positives are concentrated in about, you know, a pretty small percentage of the herd unit. Now, it's not the best example because unfortunately I wish we had more samples from all this. But now let's compare that to, this is deer hunt area 66, which is just south of Casper. And in this case, you can see that the red dots are positive. I should have said that for both these. The red are positive. Here the blue are negatives. Here the black are negatives. But here you can see the distribution of CWD within this hunt area is really widely distributed. And these samples are also really representative of where actually all the deer and the deer hunting occurs. So this is just to illustrate an example. If we were going to go down this road, perhaps maybe the managers up there in Worland might want to look at and say, okay, hey, we have a pretty substantial, you know, CWD prevalence in this portion of the herd unit. It may make sense to reduce some densities here, but maybe not here. So then we also talk about hot spots. Again, getting back to the example of several deer that may test positive in one hayfield. I mean, there's an example north of Douglas where over the years I've been involved with the management of that deer herd for over 15 years now, and we've repeatedly had positive deer come off these fields, whether they're deer showing clinical signs and the landowner calls me to come out and just kill them, or just from hunter harvest. And so in some of these areas where and there's a lot of deer that pack in this area, and it's both mule deer and whitetail, it may behoove us to go in there and reduce deer there for a prolonged period of time until we think maybe we're getting a handle on it, and then allow deer to come back in the future. If we do this, you know, anytime we're talking about embarking on these strategies, hunter harvest is always going to be our preferred method. One thing that, in my view, got somewhat of an unfortunate headline just recently, I mean, Scott talked about some of the social media is that it appeared like this plan is overstating the potential use of sharpshooters to conduct this. Let me assure you guys, hunter harvest is always going to be our preferred method. But there are some cases where perhaps they could play a role, and the public, through the collaborative process, wanted to keep that tool in the toolbox. For example, we've done an urban deer reduction in the city of Sundance in my region. I think we're doing, Teal, help me out, I think one's been done in Rawlins or is being done in Rawlins.
Yeah, this is last month.
Yeah, now this wasn't specifically to reduce CWD. In the case of Sundance, it was because of just urban deer conflict issues. But perhaps that's in places like the city of Casper, over the years have kind of quit testing them, but perhaps it's time to start again. But we see a pretty high CWD prevalence where deer congregate in the city of Casper because folks are feeding them and things like that. And in those cases, you're within city limits, so we can't use hunter harvest. In cases like Sundance, we've actually hired the PD, well, not, excuse me, I shouldn't say hired. The PD has implemented harvest, and then we're actually testing and donating those harvested deer through a meat donation program. In other cases, there may just not be safe shooting lanes. So with these hunter harvest management strategies, like I said, it never hurts to reiterate, intensive public outreach efforts they're going to be needed. And they're going to be, we can't go down this road at a local level without local public support. And not only will that support be paramount in developing those strategies, but also maintaining them. In a lot of places where hunter-harvest strategies have been employed, they've been employed for multiple years, and then there just hasn't been public support to maintain them. And in some cases, the local managers felt like maybe they were perhaps doing good, but the public opposition resulted in them being ceased prematurely, so they were never really able to adequately evaluate this over the long term. If we're going to go down this road with using hunter-harvest management with the local publics as we develop these strategies, we have to be very clear and transparent to you guys. We have to clearly articulate what our harvest goals are, what we think those resulting cervid densities are going to be, so there's no misunderstanding or misconception. And again, like I said, these strategies will have to be implemented over a long time frame. Some other considerations that we have to make as managers. These strategies are going to have to be specifically tailored to each herd unit or localized subpopulation. So is that herd migratory or is it non-migratory? That can really change some things. What's the productivity of that herd? In my region, there's a huge gradient between very productive deer populations up in the Black Hills that after a bad winter or another disease outbreak like EHD or something like that, that herd can rebound very, very quickly within just a few years because they are so productive. If you take some of the country that is in my region west of Casper, these are desert mule deer herds. They're fairly unproductive. They're very slow to grow even when environmental conditions are favorable. So we have to consider differences in herd productivity. We have to, again, where's that population relative to our commission-defined objective? And then what's the hunting season structure that we already have in place? Is it a limited quota deer herd, elk herd, whatever, or is it general license? Or a combination of both. What are the land ownership patterns that are there? That's a really big one. Certainly private landowners support a heck of a lot of the state's wildlife in this state, and in some places where we have a lot of CWD, where we've had the highest prevalences, it's actually kind of originated in southeastern Wyoming, which is predominantly private land, but we have it in other parts of the state. If we don't have private landowners on board and in support of this, it may be all for naught if we can only apply these facets of management to just a segment of what we want to do. That may not be successful if we can't address all the deer in that population or subpopulation. Then what other factors are at play? Like what are the predation pressures on this population? What are other diseases? Like in the Black Hills deer, we have outbreaks of blue tongue and EHD and things like that. What are the winter severities? So again, some populations face, like the Wyoming range in western Wyoming, face periodic bad winters every 4 to 5 years. In other parts of the state, it's pretty rare to lose a whole bunch of deer in any one winter. Okay, so all right. So the other really big change that this plan is going to have us do, and this is very meaningful inside the department, is that our biologists, as they formulate their annual hunting season recommendations, are going to now be tasked with incorporating CWD management concerns in their hunting season justifications and their job completion reports. A job completion report is a report that biologists put out every year, and it just summarizes the annual management data in that herd and the management direction that the managers want to take it in terms of how they will manage this population towards stated objectives. So those considerations that each biologist will be putting into these annual completion reports could vary considerably. In southeastern Wyoming, where folk managers have been dealing with the disease for a long time, they may be articulating some hunting season strategies that they already know that they want to implement to address this. In other cases, in other parts of the state, CWD has not been documented yet. And so those managers in those cases may not have stated strategies to really talk about. But this will also have them chronicle CWD issues in their herd units over time. And they're gonna have to think about, you know, where are their male-female ratios within each herd when they're talking about this. And certainly relative to the strategy goal that we have defined for each herd in terms of target male ratios. What data do they have to work with in their particular herd? What's their prevalence estimate? Do we have, in some cases, you know, we have really, really good long-term CWD prevalence data. We know with a fair amount of certainty what percentage of our deer have that disease. In other cases, sampling's pretty new, or we've gotten insufficient sample sizes and we don't know that. And also, what's the distribution of our sampling within a herd? Is 90% of your sampling occur in 10% of the area, or vice versa? So those are all considerations that they're going to be making. But, you know, finally, it'll just result in just some potential strategies that they think they may be able to implement. Again, requiring public input and support. Lastly on this, we'll continue as always to engage landowners to the extent possible to just continue to provide as much access as we're able to. We have things like our Access Yes program that really does a great thing in terms of providing access to private land. And certainly it takes a lot of sacrifice on behalf of those landowners that enroll in those programs. And then perhaps one of the most important things here is that, you know, we'll continue to commit to engaging with other agencies, universities, you name it, but relevant bodies and entities, just to bolster the broader understanding of CWD management. So what are the lessons that we've learned from strategies that we employ? What has worked, and perhaps more importantly, what has not worked, and disseminate that information within our state and also within, you know, outside the state. So we'll continue to meet with other states regarding that. Okay, so this came up quite a bit in our collaborative process. It's mandatory sample. So the public and the working group, and rightly so, expressed some concern like, okay, you guys are going to go down this road and you're going to say increased deer harvest in the area, and you're not quite sure if it's going to work or not. And of course we're saying, yeah, in a lot of cases we're not sure if it's going to work, but we think it's worth trying. There's some science and some data to suggest it's worth trying these things. But by golly, if you're going to do that, you guys better get every deer sampled that you guys that gets killed in the course of implementing these strategies, and therefore you should make that mandatory, that sampling. And I would remind folks that a lot of folks aren't aware of this. A couple years ago in our Chapter 2 General Hunting Regulation, we actually implemented within that regulation, actually, we now have the authority to require mandatory sampling if need be. But our preference is going to be to use voluntary sampling when and wherever possible. Now, in some cases, let's just say we're doing a management strategy in a place where we harvest hundreds of deer. Well, it's probably going to be pretty easy for us to get a good sample size so we can adequately evaluate changes in prevalence over time. In other cases, like maybe one of those desert deer herds I talked about west of Casper, it's really hard for us to get our hands on harvested deer because they're limited quota areas and things like that. So in those, if we have to go down that road and use mandatory sample submission, we will. No matter what we do, there's going to be an intensive education and outreach effort on our part anytime we're going down this road to educate the public and really demonstrate that need for sample submission. So the final thing is some additional agency and regulatory action. So we're going to engage the DEQ, YDOT.
There's a question.
I have a question here. It's probably very apparent or relatively easy to see from the previous presentation, this thing about mandatory sampling. The state of Colorado's been in it for several years now. I'm sure you've spoken of it. But from the previous presentation here, the ability to handle all these sampling is chicken or the egg. There is no ability to handle a high increase in mandatory sampling at this time.
Well, Actually, yeah, there is.
There is.
In terms of, and Hank, you can jump in here if need be, but, so our current capacity at the lab is about 15,000 samples per year. Recent years, we've been somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000, 6,500, correct?
Without mandatory.
Without mandatory. So now that we've shifted our surveillance priorities to now we're focusing on, we call them focus or priority herds within each region. So for example, in my region, we just had 2 deer herds that were focus herds. And that's so we can get better CWD prevalence data just to inform even future management. In the case of these 2 deer herds, we don't even have a clue what prevalence is out there. So those priorities will shift within the region over time. But we're well below our capacity now.
Really?
Yeah. So
Only because people aren't submitting.
that's correct. And it's fair to say outside of our focus or our priority areas, the vast majority of samples that come in, I'm out at the Casper office, we get a ton of them that come into Casper. It's just folks that have human health concerns. They just simply, they're not so much doing it for our data purposes, they just want their animal tested before they feed it to their family type thing.
So you haven't done any work about the estimates about mandatory sampling until you're ready to do it?
Well, you're right, it does become the chicken or the egg a little bit. I can tell you that because, you know, I kind of glossed over it fairly quickly, but at the very beginning when we talk about that before-after control impact study design, in the case of what we consider to be kind of a significant management action, we're going to need to get really good baseline data before we go do that, because otherwise we're not going to be able to detect if there was any change in prevalence resulting from that action. So it is fair to say that we're not going to embark on what I would consider to be, and significant can mean different things to different people, but a significant management action without having our ducks in a row and really understanding where the baseline is.
Sorry to interrupt. You were at the point where the public reaction to mandatory seems to be very positive, the way I heard it.
That's correct, but it can be easier said than done in terms of, and I'm just kind of what if in this though, like, you know, we'd have to be practical where we would apply that, because let's just say we wanted to get a really good estimate in an elk herd. And now we have tools that where we educate hunters on how to pull their own samples and things like that. But are we going to make every hunter pack a cow elk head out of the backcountry for, you know, those that don't know how to pull their own sample and that sort of thing? So there's just some considerations we have to make there. The other thing is in some cases, you know, certainly when we pull the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, that destroys the cape of the deer. Like Lee said, you know, we do follow up after the deer's been to a taxidermist and things like that. But in some cases that maybe, you know, that may or may not be very easy to do. And we can't destroy the cape of someone's deer that they were wanting to put on the wall. So there's just a lot of factors to consider there. Any other questions before we? Okay. So as far as this additional agency regulatory action, again, a lot of this is just stuff that we're kind of already doing. So we do have plans here. It's actually just next week. We're engaging with the DEQ and WYDOT and some folks from the Wyoming County Commissioners Association. And we're going to have a meeting to address just carcass disposal issues across the state. There's been a lot of change there with solid waste operators throughout communities in Wyoming. In some cases, some landfills are no longer accepting carcasses. They're going to transfer stations and things like that. So because, and I think Hank touched on this, I mean, you know, certainly infected deer carcasses are a potential source of environmental contamination. So that's something that we're going to address through this meeting and ongoing from there. We're going to continue to enforce the Wyoming statutory prohibition on cervid ownership. You know, for anybody that doesn't know, Wyoming has about the most stringent laws in the country regarding private ownership of cervids. We don't allow any game farms in the state, with the exception of one old game farm, the NX Bar up by Sheridan, that was grandfathered in decades and decades ago. We'll continue to enforce, our Chapter 10 regulation, which governs the importation and possession of wildlife, and then our Chapter 2 regulation that will enforce and educate folks on our Chapter 2 regulation that addresses the importation, exportation, and transportation of harvested cervids throughout the state. We're going to continue to remove with what we call targeted surveillance or targeted removal. That's basically the case, like I was talking about north of Douglas, where a landowner, member of the public, someone calls you and says, hey, I got a sick looking deer. In that case, our wardens, our biologists are going out and they're removing that animal, getting it off the landscape. So we'll continue with that. Again, continue to collaborate with other relevant entities, state, federal, tribal, international agencies, universities, you name it, in the world of CWD management. Continue to engage with those folks to share information. And then continue to engage with taxidermists and meat processors just on proper disposal of cervid carcasses from parts. All cervid carcasses that come into the department's possession, a common example of that. Hopefully it's not too common because most hunters are law abiding, but every now and then our wardens do have to confiscate and seize illegally harvested animals. In those cases, we have a mandatory sampling of those animals, and obviously CWD positive animals will not be donated through our donation program. We are continuing to partner with, this is something that started just recently with the University of Wyoming, to develop a statewide database of genotypes. Hank mentioned it fairly briefly, but there is a genotype with deer and elk where they're not resistant to the disease, but they tend to get the disease at a lower prevalence than those deer in those areas or elk that don't have that certain genetic makeup, and they live a lot longer. So one of the things we would really like to understand and evaluate is there potentially, in the face of this increasing prevalence of CWD, is there genetic shift that's going on in response to that. We saw some potential evidence for that in a deer study southwest of Douglas. This seems kind of minuscule, but we're actually going to pursue the authority to regulate the use of cervid urine. It's become an increasingly popular thing across the country, where game farms in other states, and in some cases there's not much regulation, and we do see a lot of CWD in some game farms in parts of the country, where they're actually manufacturing cervid urine for bait, scent lure, things like that. And so to potentially prohibit that in the state of Wyoming. Because again, I think Hank may have touched on this, those prions can be found in bodily fluids, feces, urine, things like that, saliva. So then, now we're on to research. Throughout the collaborative process, the working group identified several research priorities. Certainly anytime we're talking CWD with the public, CWD management, there's always the question of what don't you guys know? And I can tell you, thankfully, we know an awful lot more about CWD than we ever did before. Collectively, not just the Wyoming Game and Fish, but wildlife managers and veterinarians across the country. But there's still a lot we don't know in terms of dynamics with this disease, certainly within free-ranging populations. So there's a lot of research priorities that have been identified. First and foremost, after talking about all these disease management strategies, there's some research projects. We're gonna need to evaluate how effective some of our hunter harvest strategies are. So there's gonna be some pretty robust research projects coming out of that, hopefully. The other thing I should back up and state, the one thing that can kind of be prohibitive of CWD research is just the cost. Because again, like we talked about, that slow moving nature of this disease, you have to evaluate changes in this disease over a long period of time. And what that means is it kind of means expensive research in a lot of cases. So understanding how effective these hunter harvest strategies are is one. Better understanding, the correlation between environmental contamination with disease prevalence and transmission. So for a lot of cases, one of the questions that we always get is this disease being spread from animal to animal? Is it being spread from environment to animal, or both? And that really probably varies. It depends on where you are, probably within the epidemiological curve of that disease. So how long has that disease been established? So in cases where the disease is relatively new to an area, chances are it's spread more from animal to animal. But then as that disease becomes entrenched and established over a long time frame, there's a lot more environmental accumulation of those prions. And in all likelihood, environmental transmission is playing a much larger role. But we don't always really know that. And so it'd be helpful to understand some of those differences to the extent possible. Down here, we're talking about assist in the validation of experimental assays for CWD prion detection in the environment. And these are some of the tests, and I won't go into all that. And frankly, I don't even understand all those. But basically what that is some folks far smarter than I are working towards developing some tests, and they've made some headway where you can actually sample for prions in the environment. And so we as an agency would just assist in the validation of those tests. So whether testing it for soils, or like I talked about around a salt lick or something like that, or potentially even around a water supply. Some of the other research would be just better understanding the role of genetics in CWD transmission, investigating the relative importance of indirect versus direct. I guess I kind of touched on that already. Again, evaluating some techniques to exclude cervids around some of these traditional ag practices without impacting the ag practice, the agricultural operations themselves. So such as some of that salt site work. And just evaluate how cervid habitat selection and habitat improvement projects may influence CWD prevalence and transmission. Evaluate the effect and implication of predators and large carnivores on CWD dynamics within a free-ranging population. While there's some very good evidence to suggest mountain lions selectively prey on CWD positive animals, we don't really know what role they're playing in managing that disease. Is every deer a lion kills additive, in the face of a struggling deer population, or is it potentially mitigating in terms of taking some positive animals out of the population? So that's an aspect we'd like to look at. Studying the effects of interspecific competition on CWD. This is something that came up like in some of my backyard stuff, like the Laramie Range. There are places where we get several thousand elk concentrating on winter ranges that 30, 40 years ago actually had very few elk, but they're right over the top of some of these veg communities that mule deer use. And in some cases, like perhaps there was some concern that came up on the working group that maybe those elk are actually squeezing deer into a smaller area or less suitable winter range, or just concentrating deer more. And that could potentially be influencing CWD dynamics. And then just looking at regional differences in CWD, and then another, assist in the validation or collaborate with the evaluation of a CWD vaccine. That's a very common question that comes up. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that right now. That's probably a pipe dream. Like one of the things Hank will always tell you is that these prion diseases are just kind of a different cat. They're not a virus. They're not a bacteria. And perhaps most importantly, because it's a misfolded protein, the animal actually doesn't recognize that prion as being an antigen, and therefore doesn't develop an immune response. And for those reasons, developing a vaccine is going to be very difficult. And then let's just say if they did that, then how do you administer that in a wild free-ranging population over a very large landscape? That's it for research. So we're almost done here. So switching gears a little bit, another thing that this plan will require us to do is we're going to codify our internal CWD management team. We have warden and biologist representation and I&E specialists, don't forget about Janet, from around the state that represent each game and fish wildlife division region. And that team was kind of where this process spurred off of. But this team now will be codified into the future as like kind of a long-term working group. As what this team will do will be, will provide assistance to the regions if necessary on helping develop some of these management strategies. We're going to chronicle management actions. So ultimately, I would assume some entities, perhaps the Game and Fish Commission, would like to know, okay, great, you guys have all this new CWD management plan. What the heck are you doing with it? What's working, what's not? So this team will serve to kind of chronicle and catalog all that over time. We'll assist as needed in developing additional surveillance and monitoring strategies, especially to get at collecting the data that's necessary to inform some of these management actions. The team will also just stay apprised of emerging research and or new information or new lessons learned from other states that are applying these strategies, and then disseminate that. And then, lastly, just ensure that all the necessary communications are occurring within our agency and outside the agency regarding CWD, CWD research, and management actions. So how is this plan going to be applied? That's another question that's at the tip of a lot of folks' tongues. This plan is really meant to be an umbrella document, and it's meant to provide a list of potential management options. This plan does not have a cookbook or a list that's already been predetermined that says, hey, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to do it in locations A, B, and C. The plan does not do that. It basically serves as an umbrella document to guide some regional managers to provide them some options to consider implementing in their areas. But again, there's that requisite public outreach and communications that have to occur with that. And wherever we apply these management strategies, they're going to be determined at a local level. I know I've said that multiple times, but I continue to stress that. It's very important. And these actions that we're going to propose are going to vary in scale. So, like in my mind, I kind of see 3 tiers of this. For example, like one question that I've gotten already repeatedly is, we're about to enter our season setting time frame this coming February and March. Like, do the game and fish biologists and wardens, do you guys already have all these season strategy changes lined up and ready to go? And the answer to that is no, we don't. And some regions are much more ingrained or engrossed in this issue because they've been dealing with CWD for a long time. In other regions, we haven't even really documented CWD there. Unfortunately, there's very few places in the state we haven't, as you can see from Hank's map. But they're going to vary in significance and scale. So in some cases, there may just be some really low-hanging fruit, like perhaps, in a case where, again, going back to Martin's example, where you get a whole bunch of deer out of one hayfield or a hay corral or whatever, maybe we can work with that landowner to provide some fencing, something like that, or develop a strategy that says we're going to harvest deer in this select part of the herd unit. So some low-hanging fruit, and then other strategies may occur within the confines or the constraints of our current management framework we already have. So, and I'm not saying we're going to do this, but just an example would be west of Casper, have really, really high buck ratios. And our management strategy that's approved by the commission says we need to manage for between 30 and 45 bucks per 100 does. Well, maybe, and we don't have the CWD data there yet, but just maybe if we had data to suggest we have high CWD prevalence, then we should implement some actions. That maybe we take that buck ratio down to the lower range of that strategy. Instead of having like 48 bucks per 100 does like we've had recently, maybe we should take that down into the low 30s, but still stay within the framework that we've already obligated to the public that we'll manage for. And in other cases, some of these actions on down the road may rise to the level of being significant, like some meaningful, significant, elevated hunter harvest beyond what we normally would do. And then another thing I'd like to stress too is one common misconception that folks can have is that these management strategies, we should only be doing these strategies where we have really high prevalence of CWD, because that's where we see the most impacts. And it's true. If you're a deer manager in, whether in Lee's part of the world or Martin's part of the world or mine, where we've seen some pretty significant impacts, we think, from this disease. The tendency is saying, hey, we should do all our management there. And it can be a lot trickier thing to sell to the public in places where we haven't dealt with this disease very long, and they're not used to, it's not ingrained in their consciousness to say, hey, we should implement management over here. Well, in some cases, we have to consider that perhaps some of these CWD management strategies may actually be most effective in areas where CWD prevalence is really low. Because in some cases, like in my part of the world, some of our herds may have so much environmental transmission and accumulation of prions that management strategies won't be effective. Now, we don't know that, but that's just one more consideration that we have to make. So this document does try to point out that CWD management strategies should be done at all prevalences, or at least considered, I should say. Not just areas where we've had the disease really well established.
Couple more minutes and then.
Okay. So, I'm almost done anyway. So I'm going to kind of just reiterate some of what Scott said. We do understand with some of these strategies there's some level of concern. And that, I guess the other thing to continue to stress is that in some cases these strategies are going to be experimental in nature, and we're not entirely sure that they're going to work. But again, data and experience from some other places, some based on theoretical modeling, some based on management that's occurred in other places, suggests that some of these strategies are really worth trying. But they are experimental in nature, largely, over the long term. And so there's a little bit of natural trepidation, like, are we going to do something significant to our deer herds when we don't know if it's going to work? So, we get that, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We understand that concern is out there. And frankly, folks in our own agency have that concern to an extent. But we really feel like it's still incumbent upon us to try. And there's risks with doing some of this. In some cases, some of these strategies may not work. And we have to be very upfront and articulate that to the public, that they may not. But again, we wouldn't do them if we didn't think they were worth trying. But also, just something to kind of maybe leave you with is that doing nothing is also a risk. When we embarked down the road of this collaborative process, one of the very first things we did was survey the public. We surveyed 1,500 members of the public, or maybe it was 3,000, I can't remember. So we surveyed 1,500 members of the public that have reported to have hunted in areas that we consider to be high CWD prevalence, in terms of it was like, where do we have it in 10% or more of the deer documented, and then 1,500 hunters that have hunted in areas where we consider it to be lower, less than 10 or less than 5% CWD prevalence. Anyway, without going into all those details, one of the questions that we asked them are what is the most acceptable thing to do, and versus unacceptable, and I'm probably not framing this quite right, but the take-home message from what that survey provided us was that the most unacceptable thing that the Game and Fish Department could do would be to do nothing to try to manage this disease. And that occurred across survey groups, and it was really compelling. And so frankly, doing nothing, it is a decision, and there's risk with doing that as well. So that's it for all that. This is just the very one last slide, and I'll kind of reiterate some of what Hank went through. And with human health and CWD, that's something that's always on the tips of people's minds. Like I said, in Casper, the majority of unsolicited CWD samples that come to me are folks that are just concerned about the human health aspect. They don't want to feed this animal to their family or their kids or whatever. But I'd like to reiterate that Game and Fish is not a human health agency. Well, we certainly recognize those are public concerns. They're not our primary concern. Our primary concern deals with the health of our wildlife. But because we're not a human health agency, we're going to continue to defer to recommendations from the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization. And that is, you know, basically that if you have an animal that tests positive, the recommendation is that you don't consume that meat. And just a reminder, never hurts to remind folks that to date, there's still been no documented cases of humans contracting CWD.
Okay.
I got a quick question as far as the contraction comment there you made. Some years, and I'm not sure, 4 or 5 years ago, whatever it was, down here in Colorado, this was a news story on TV. There was a woman that filed a lawsuit against the state game and fish down there because her father had died from CJD, which I don't know if you're familiar with that. Okay, and her suit mainly said that he consumed elk and deer over 40, 50 years or whatever that possibly had this. Okay, and I never heard the outcome of the lawsuit. I'm just curious if anybody else had.
Anybody heard of this lawsuit?
That's news to me. I hadn't heard that.
You'll have to look it up, Game of Fish.
Yes.
Well, and we've been hunting about the 50 years, and I know over the 50 years, we've probably consumed quite a few of them, because we like that area 6 for elk down there, and we've had, well, and our son had a positive deer this year
Yeah.
already, so.
There's no doubt, you know, statewide, I think we harvest, between deer and whitetails and white-tailed mule deer and elk. I'd have to even look it up, but 70, 80,000 or more. And, you know, and here Hank on an average year does about 6,000 samples these days. So, and certainly based on, unfortunately, some of the prevalences we're seeing, where we're getting upwards of 40+% in some of our deer herds, there's no doubt that thousands of positive animals over the years have been consumed.
I think that's the point I want to contribute this. This always bothered me a little bit about in the terminology and semantics, and I understand why. In this testing, you hear say positive or negative. These tests were done by APHIS-ADC, that's Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. That's a Department of Ag. They're for your food sources, cantaloupes, apples, whatever. They were designed really, retropharyngeal, for these animal farms, deer farms, so forth. The appropriate terminology is detected, not detected, and unusable. Now I understand why all these game and fish, and many states do it, say positive and negative, it's easy to understand. But you get the semantics and the meaning of detected, not detected, and unsuitable sample. It's saying, when we examined this submitted sample, we detected prions, we did not detect prions, you have an unsuitable sample, and by God, there's a lot of those. All right, the next, that's APHIS-ADC designed that. Okay, CDC, of course, is Center for Disease Control. That's the people, you know, infectious epidemiology and so forth. State of Colorado now, I do know in their game and fish publications and so forth, are reminding people that this test that you're submitting for is not, repeat, not a food safety test. They're guaranteeing you nothing. And if you want to talk to the Wyoming lab down here, they'll tell you on the retropharyngeal, on those lymph nodes, even for positive, negative, but really detecting, undetected, they're about 97, 98%. So when your sample comes back, it's up to you.
I think you make a fair point.
I wanted to contribute that.
I put it up here for the group to consider. Thank you. Any other questions? Justin just gave you a 50-minute lecture. And I think it illustrates really well the complexity, you know, that I was talking about earlier. So I know it's a lot, but do you have any questions? Or yeah, go for it.
Justin, I'm assuming that when they're testing for prions in the environment, they're testing for misfolded or these abnormal prions in the environment, not just any prion in the environment, because there's billions of them, right?
So when you say we're testing in the soil, or we're testing in a wheat stalk, or whatever it might be, that is looking for the prions that are misfolded that have the potential to cause CWD in something that might consume it. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I guess I'd say first of all, we're not doing that. We would
No, I
just,
understand, but I mean,
but
research is.
I'd probably kick that one to, I bet Mary could do a better job answering that than I could.
Sure, yes, those are testing for the abnormal.
Oh, well, I could have said that.
Other questions? I'm sorry, did you have your hand up? No? What about concerns? You guys worried about anything? What are you worried about? I think it's important for game fish to know that.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess I'm worried about the deer and the elk hunting, and I've got kids and grandkids and got great-grandkids that are coming now, and I want them to be able to hunt the deer and the elk and
Yeah.
everything like everybody else. If this gets completely out of control and we lose our deer herd, then we lose part of our lives and what was important to us. And
Very well said.
I think all of us need to realize that we need to work on this just as hard as we possibly can. Now, we've been sending samples in especially out of that area 6 down
Okay. Thank you.
there. And hopefully, everybody else, if we can roll the samples through, I think it ought to be mandatory in some of those areas where, we know it's in the Laramie Range up through here all the way, but let's make it mandatory in those areas where you don't see it. Like that one you were talking about up there by Casper. Limited quota, make them turn the samples in. Let's see if it's in that herd too.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is, there's a chance we may have to go down that road, but, I mean, your suggestion is just to do it. In my
Yes.
opinion, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Are there any tests currently being developed to do non-lethal testing?
Well, you can, so that's being done already with research, so there's 2 types of tests you can do in a live animal. Unfortunately, they require sedation, of that animal, so you have to have the animal in hand, but you can do tonsil or rectal biopsies,
Okay.
and test for it that way.
But traditionally, it's just necropsy after the fact, after they've been killed.
Correct.
Currently, most of your testing.
And the other one that comes up commonly, I guess I didn't hear it tonight, but we've heard it at the other 2 meetings, are, what are the odds of developing a field test kit for hunters? And Hank can jump in if I misspeak here, but the odds are pretty low because of the federal certification requirements and things like that to do that.
For the hunter to test himself.
What's that?
For the hunter to test himself.
Yeah, there's companies that are working on it, but
What's a false positive on that?
that's a concern, yeah.
There's a lot
Anything
of
to add?
quality control that goes in with CWD testing, and the fear is that these field tests, you're just not gonna be able to build that in.
Right.
So it's unlikely we're gonna have a approved field test anytime soon.
Other questions? Other worries? Yeah, of course.
This isn't really a question, and I'm not really looking for an answer right now, but
Yeah.
it is something that occurred to me as I listened to your excellent presentation, and thank you for that. And that is when you talk about the hot spots that are known, and then you've mentioned several times, like a hayfield or a hay yard or something like that, where deer congregate, it attracts them, and the possibility of using sort of targeted lethal control, either hunt or harvest or whatever, to reduce the density of the animals in those hot spots. I'm just thinking about it seems like you would have to keep that up for maybe 20 years. because if you reduce the animal density in a hot spot like that, and it's been a hot spot for a while, it's gonna be highly contaminated. So if you do it for a couple of years and reduce the density and then let nature take its course, deer are gonna filter right back in there, or elk or whatever it is. And so you're not really gonna see any benefit, frankly, it seems like. And I'm just kind of thinking my way through that, but it would be interesting to see more discussion about that, I guess, as
And
this goes
oh,
forward. No, that's okay.
Well, I mean, you raise a very good point, and so, I mean, it's gonna be such a site-specific thing, so perhaps in one case, maybe just some exclusionary fence just redistributes the animals permanently. So it's not always necessarily going to be a lethal removal, but in other cases, yeah, if you're not excluding the attractant, you know, whether it be fencing or whatever it may be, you know, yeah, and when you know, deer come back in 10 years or whatever, you may have the same problem, but in the case of maybe if an individual or a group of haystacks, perhaps, if you had a willing landowner, maybe you could move them after you do the management action and move it to a new area and you reduce deer densities. I mean, I'm just kind of what if in that, but I mean, yeah, those are things that, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, that's not something that a biologist can sit there and just dream up all on his or her own, you know, I mean, because the landowner might go, well, we need to address it over here, duh, you know, type thing. So there, you would want input from local landowners in a case like that too. So yeah, it can be really variable, but yeah, the point being, did you gain anything if deer come back and they just come right back down with the disease? So.
I've got it up here for consideration.
And I guess my other comment, and then I will be quiet.
No.
Is that there was a very fleeting reference in one of these presentations about game and fish run feed grounds. And in fact, in a big chunk of the state, that is a huge, whatever you called it, artificial concentration source. And I know what the plan is to, you know, dig more deeply into that topic over the coming year, which I'm really glad to see that commitment by the department, because I think that that's a case where we might be able to prevent a contaminated hot spot from developing, or not if we continue to follow current practices there. So I'm glad that you're gonna look at that soon, and the sooner the better.
Sure, I mean, we certainly felt with the recognition of the upcoming process that we'd be, when I mentioned things like artificial cervid concentration, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge feed grounds.
So, nice segue. Brad?
Sure. So I will be fairly brief in discussing elk feed grounds. And the reason for that is elk feed ground management in western Wyoming was largely off the table for the working group. And the reason for that is we truly feel...
Brad, may I correct you on that, please?
Yes.
Sorry. It wasn't off the table. It was absolutely on the table. Feed grounds were massively discussed in the public meetings and in the working group. But it was not because, like I said earlier, the focus for you all and the working group was the state in general.
I was getting at that.
Okay, but it wasn't off the table.
Right, yeah, but we told the working group that, you know, this isn't something that we want you to tackle. And the reason we felt that way is we felt like it was a big enough issue and a complex enough issue that it might bog down the working group in the process that they all went through over the year. And so what we really wanted to do was have its own process. We felt like the feed ground management of elk in western Wyoming warranted its own process, a public engagement process to tackle that issue on its own. And so, and we told the working group that. And there was a lot of comments in the previous round of meetings that we had in May and June earlier in the year about, you know, elk feed grounds. And the working group felt like it was their responsibility to address that, and they did. And they also put forth a recommendation to the department that we engage in a public process for looking into elk feed ground management in western Wyoming. And so that's why there's the section in the plan that deals with elk feedlots. And it's a really complex process. We've been managing elk in western Wyoming through feed grounds for over a century. And it's not something you make changes to very quickly. And it's something that we're only going to be able to make changes to with broad public support from the public. And so we're looking at more of a localized working group for that. However, we also realize that there's statewide interest in elk feed ground management in western Wyoming. So even though will be more of a localized process, we're certainly looking to make sure we expand that to statewide interests in elk management in western Wyoming. We're still trying to look at that and see what that process looks like. We're taking a really close look at this working group process to see how well it works and how this process can be applied to the feed ground subject. And so we're having a lot of internal conversations about that and taking a close look to see what is going to work for a process to address elk feed ground management in western Wyoming, and how can we make a group like that successful in that endeavor. So one thing there is a feed ground section in this plan. And what that feed ground section essentially consists of is some background on the history and the purpose of feed grounds. We talk about what we do for surveillance and monitoring for CWD on the elk feed grounds in western Wyoming. We also talk about, in western Wyoming on elk feed grounds, we deal with other diseases. So we talk about the things we're currently doing for disease management on feed grounds in western Wyoming. You've all heard of brucellosis. We deal with brucellosis in elk on feed grounds, and we have a lot of strategies in place on feed grounds to help mitigate the effects of disease and explain what we do there. The remainder of what's in the plan is largely consists of a lot of the information and guidance that was put into the 2016 chronic wasting disease management plan. Had really, really good guidance for the game and fish on coordination with the public and federal agencies and the things we do currently. And we felt like that was all still appropriate to maintain as we go through a larger process to deal with feed grounds. And so a lot of that is still intact in this current draft plan. That's about all I have to say on feed grounds, unless you have questions. But that process we'll expect to be picked up and start and move forward late spring, early summer this year as we wrap up this process and have a commission-approved CWD management plan in place after this process.
Any questions for Brad regarding feed ground? All right.
It's easy.
Sorry for interrupting you.
No problem.
Okay, any more questions? Yes, ma'am.
I did have one.
Good.
You guys briefly touched on using apex predators. So as a livestock producer, I'm really opposed to that. We run cattle down the state line, and I know supposedly there are no wolves down there. There are wolves down there. We've seen them down there. We've seen the tracks. And we also ran cattle at Virginia Dale, and we did have problems with wolves. And in the past several years, we've lost horses to mountain lions. So I would really rather not use apex predators, if possible, as a means to control CWD.
So, I mean, your comment's well taken, and there's certainly any time you've ever worn a red shirt and talked about deer and elk management around the state with, hunter landowners or something. I mean, predation concerns it's always a big concern, and especially to livestock producers.
I realize it's a hot button.
So I do want to be clear though that this management plan does not have a strategy in place that suggests that the department is going to use predators as a management tool. That's how, and this discussion was actually had through our collaborative process as well. That's how it got put in the research section. So there's a need to just kind of, from my perspective personally, just to better understand what the role of predation is in influencing CWD dynamics. but it's not necessarily to use them as a management tool.
Right, I find it fascinating that the lions seem to pick out the deer with CWD for whatever reason, because, I mean, obviously they would pick out the weak. But if they're going after CWD positives that are healthy, where are they doing it? I think that's fascinating in itself.
Sure.
But I shudder to think of doing that.
And I guess it would say, you know, this goes without saying with kind of any of these potential disease management strategies. Like I had a slide up there, like we have to consider things like migratory or non-migratory deer, or what, you know, buck ratios, all those things. Like predation, you know, if there was ever a management recommendation that came out regarding predation, whether it's kill more predators, kill less predators, I mean, there's always, anything that Game and Fish does, there's always other concerns that have to be balanced there. And so those, we would have to recognize that and balance those concerns with our other constituents.
You know, actually, that question, just so you know, when you look at the back of the plan, there are a number of appendices. There's one appendix that shows you how the working group, the level of consensus that each recommendation got, and I believe that recommendation was thoroughly discussed, and I don't think it got consensus because we heard the same concerns that you're voicing. But you can look in the back and see how much consensus each recommendation got, and then there's another appendix that shows where it's being discussed in the plan. And it can also say that there may be some recommendations that have not been adopted for Game and Fish, and they've given a clarification of why not, so that you understand that. So look at those, in this case, the appendix is a good place to look. Another question back there, yeah, sir.
In your presentation, I know you talked quite a bit about herd reduction, and especially in the adult bucks and so forth. Around this state, you know, there's a lot of sheep herders left with sheep herder deductive reasoning, and they kind of might want to say, why do we have to kill all these deer? Are we going to kill them to kill them before they die of CWD, or do we have to burn this village down to save it, or what's going on here? What's your major premise or your hypothesis? And I grant you said a lot of this is experimental, and we're not sure. But what's your basic starting point for herd reductions to combat CWD?
Well, I mean, certainly we would be looking at places where we've documented the disease at, you know, whatever prevalence is, but I guess it's a tough nut to crack because it's going to depend, you know, every herd unit is different. And I can't speak for, you know, some of what our managers and other
Would you
parts
put it in
of
the plan for them to use? What's your major premise?
Yeah, I mean, so it could be, you know, based on our surveillance data, our monitoring data that suggests, hey, we have, you know, some CWD prevalence issues over here. Maybe it's incumbent upon us to reduce deer densities in this area, or maybe in some cases where we have really high deer densities, like the Black Hills, it may be worth just reducing deer numbers there before the disease ever gets really well established. I mean, it's been there for a long
So
time.
your major premise is density reduction will help?
Well, potentially, but it may not in some other areas, because like I did have a little blurb in that presentation at the very end that, you know, one of the things I hear is the cure going to be worse than the disease, or are you guys are gonna kill deer before they die of disease? And we're certainly cognizant of those concerns, but boy, it's tough. I don't have really concrete examples for you, but in some places it's not always just density reduction. We're also talking about things like male ratios. And in that Colorado example that I talked about, they just shifted timing of harvest in some areas. Well, they didn't do it specifically to combat CWD because it's their current season framework. But one of the things they're noticing is that later season harvest may be having an effect on subsequent years of CWD prevalence. So maybe it's worth looking at that in some areas. So there's not a concrete premise like if deer densities exceed some certain threshold, we better go in and reduce them.
I can take a crack at that.
Help me out too.
So your kind of hypothesis and premise for that, really looking at those harvest management strategies, would be looking at, can we optimize harvest in some way to proportionally take out some of the proportion of the population most likely to be positive for CWD? So in some cases, that is probably going to be a targeted increase in buck harvest because males are more likely to have CWD than females in most areas to the best of our knowledge. In some areas, though, we know that female prevalence is high as well. And so in those cases where that hypothesis gets expanded beyond just increasing harvest on the proportion of the population most likely to have CWD, is looking to actually increase both segments of that population, since both males and females.
So you feel like you're firm enough on your statistics on those males, those large buck males. You're not worried about the sampling because that's what everybody kills and that's where your samplings come from. You've done enough stats on it, you feel okay there.
So what I would say on that is Wyoming's data is not comprehensive when it comes to female prevalence, but there are a lot of other areas where data is comprehensive, and that is replicated in Colorado, in Alberta, in Wisconsin, and so we've seen it replicated over and over and over again. We have some areas in Wyoming where we have enough data and confidence to say we've seen that, and we have a lot of areas where we don't necessarily have that confidence.
Thank you.
Yep.
Question in the back.
What's the end game here? I think eradication is probably out the window. It looks like an achievable 10-year goal for CWD in the state or your specific districts.
That's a good question, and I mean, there's really not. I mean, you know, if you had to sum it up in one concise statement, the goal would be to attempt to manage this disease, to either reduce CWD prevalence to the extent possible, or at least prevent it from growing or maintain. But it's also to apply a bunch of these different strategies in different areas and see what we can learn, and again also see what we're learning from other states as well, just to see what works and what doesn't. Anything to add to that?
I guess I would add too, from what we've seen so far, you know, CWD is going to react a little bit differently in each herd unit. So as Justin pointed out many times, what may work here is not going to work somewhere else. So we've got a lot of learning to do to figure this out.
One of the things that came up repeatedly on our collaborative process that was a huge discussion point was whether or not we should implement management triggers. So whether when prevalence exceeds a certain percent, you know, you shall do some kind of management. And for a whole host of reasons, we decided not to go down that road. Namely though, because perhaps some of the most effective management that we could apply may be in areas where CWD prevalence is lower. And so putting a hard, fast trigger in there is, you know, we recommend that we attempt some of these strategies at all prevalence levels.
I saw a hand up, yeah.
Thanks. So Justin, I'm concerned that this will devolve into random acts of kindness around the state. You know, we'll go into some place and we'll put in a fence around a place where we have a lot of positives, and we can check the box and say we've done something, or over here we're gonna reduce buck harvesting. And I mean, you know as well as I do how hard it is to keep seasons consistent from one year to the next, much less for a long period of time. And so until we can commit as a people, a state, and an agency to say, we're gonna look at this experimental, and we are actually gonna implement something on the ground for a long period of time to see, does this really work? And then really the most important thing isn't, did we decrease prevalence of CWD, but did we increase survival of deer? Should be what we should be the end game, what we're looking at. And I don't see that happening in the season setting process or anything else, unless we go in and experimentally design something and say, these are the kind of seasons that we need to do in order to try to evaluate that, and then see if we can't make that happen somewhere.
I mean, I think that's extremely well said, Bob, and I agree 100% with everything you said. I mean, you know, certainly I got to think for some of you in this audience that maybe haven't attended a Hank CWD 101 or something like that, or certainly folks that weren't in the collaborative process, which is the majority, almost all of you guys. I mean, it's kind of like drinking out of a fire hose, and I certainly couldn't stand up here for 50 minutes in front of a group of people in Casper and talk about the issues with CWD, the potential impacts to our deer herds, and oh, by the way, we better do this to fix it all in one night. So in some of these cases where we're gonna embark on down the road of some significant harvest strategies, something like that, there's gonna have to be a massive education component to that, demonstrate the need, and then hopefully garner public support for it. But that's a huge challenge for us.
So in the areas with a high CWD with a really high buck ratio, and you're saying the older bucks are more prevalent, and I can see that, you know, the older they get, the higher chance they have of getting it. So in those areas, would you be more towards, like a 3-point or better type thing, or just more bucks
Potentially.
harvested? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, there's multiple ways to skin that cat, for the lack of a better way to put it. I mean, you know, some of it could be through just increased license issuance, but certainly, you know, later seasons, you know, those mature bucks are definitely more vulnerable. I mean, that brings a whole nother set of concerns when you're talking about managing a public deer herd.
Mhm.
Some folks don't want to see giant bucks get killed on winter range, and understandably so. So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot to work out, but yeah, that would be an area. For example, one thing that we just started south of Douglas just the year before last is in cases where I've had these chronically high buck ratios because of a whole lot of private land and just not getting as many bucks harvested, and we have extraordinary CWD prevalence levels there, 40+% over the long term. There we went from a 7-day general season to a 17-day general season, and we implemented an antler point restriction. And that was to maybe keep a few of those younger bucks left on what little accessible public land there is, but also allow, you know, landowners, and, you know, we got a very interested outfitter now in all this, and to allow him to harvest more of those bucks and that sort of thing. So it's a tool.
Would you look at, when you do figure out, now I know that every case is, you know, every herd is different, you know, I understand that. But if you do have a similar case in different areas of the state, would you go in and say implement this for a number of years to see if that's gonna work in that herd before you implement it, or would you attack every similar herd at one time? If you know, I could see a benefit of, I guess, either way. I mean, if you do it, if you think that you're doing what's right and you attack at everything, then you're ahead of the game. But if you go in and it's not the right thing, then you've just decimated possibly 2 or 3 different herds to something that you can't come back from. Would you guys look at that possibility of like attacking one herd sample and let's say, hey, let's focus this management process on this herd for this number of years and see if that works before we go to another herd?
So I think that's an excellent question, and certainly one of the deliberations we'll have is you know, all the blood, sweat, and tears that this group and the collaborative process put into this management plan. Is it going to be meaningful if we just do 1 or 2 little things here and then wait 10 years and evaluate it? I mean, did we accomplish anything there at a landscape level? You know, probably not. So my hope is that around the state we can implement as many of these strategies as possible. But to get more specifically at what you're talking about, if you're going to do something that you really needed to robustly evaluate, which in the case of like some of these harvest strategies we would, you would have that before after control impact design. So if you're going to really evaluate an action like increased buck harvest or density reductions or whatever, you better have a control, you know, that it has similar environmental factors that we think, you know, those herds perform similarly, just to see, hey, did it work over here as compared to areas where that action wasn't implemented.
So just real quick, I just want to comment on something that gentleman said. I think it's a great question, but you used a word that I think a lot of people are using that I don't think we used once here tonight, that's decimate. And at the end of the day, our goal is not to decimate. I mean, everybody has a different understanding of decimate.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's like scorched earth, like nothing left. And so I just want to make it clear, there's no way, shape, or form that we're going to allow deer to get decimated, elk to get decimated. So, I mean, we're starting to hear that out on, you know, rumor mill and stuff, but that term has never been said here tonight, nor is it any way, shape, or form of where we see this going is to domesticate deer herds.
You said it.
So,
May we hear from the lady first, and I want to hear from as many different kinds of people, and then we'll get to you.
I'm a county commissioner, so I've attended the different discussions that the commissioners have had over the last year or so.
Okay.
And one of the things that they talked about, and I didn't get in here till just a little bit late, so I don't know if you discussed it, was the food sources that the Purons are growing up out of the ground in the grasses, bushes, that, you're looking at me like I'm.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
He
Not at all.
needs more coffee.
Yeah.
So,
I'm getting
my
a cold,
question is there particular, and I'm gonna say forages to sort of cover everything, that maybe pull up more of the purines out of the ground than other ones?
I'm gonna kick that one to Mary.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There is research that's been done that has demonstrated prion can bind to plants and then also be taken up by the roots into the stems and the leaves of plants. That work was done, I think it was using wheatgrass, and more in a laboratory setting. So what we don't really have is comprehensive data comparing different plants and looking at that in more of a real world setting, things like that. So that's an area of research a lot of people are working on, but we don't know the answer to your question yet.
Well, yeah,
Yeah, it's a good question.
okay. Thank you.
Did they answer your question?
It answered it as well as they could
Okay,
answer.
okay, just checking. All right,
I think it was a
Sarah.
hard question.
Yes, it is.
That's why I kicked it to her.
Go ahead.
I'm just curious now, you mentioned Wisconsin, they had an issue with CWD some years back, and their idea basically was eradicate the herd. Where do they stand now with that?
Well, you can jump in, I mean.
Yeah.
As far as, compared to what Wyoming may be looking at?
Sure. So I can't speak for Wisconsin, obviously, as far as where they stand. I do know that when they first found chronic wasting disease, at least based on the published information, everything out there, they thought that they found it at the very beginning. They thought they found the first few cases, and they wanted to go in and be aggressive and eradicate the disease. And what they found out was it was pretty well established long before they ever found it. And there was a whole lot more there than they thought there was. And ultimately, that sort of more aggressive strategy was not supported by their public. And so I know that they did stop those management strategies. But they're seeing quite high prevalence, and they're starting to do some more research to try and look at what the impact of chronic wasting disease is on their populations.
To add to that, it is now in Minnesota and expanded in several counties in Minnesota, so it came out of this.
And
It's
some
in
of
Minnesota.
Wisconsin areas actually meet or exceed some of our prevalences.
Well, it
They
was
have a
New-
lot more than they thought.
It was New York that did the big kill,
Yeah.
and it worked, but that's a different situation.
Yeah, in that case, they feel like it was just a point source introduction from a game farm, and were able to deal with it that way.
Yes.
I don't want to dominate this, but I thought this when the first slide went up. This is gonna sound overly critical, but it's an impression I have. When you make a plan, you've got a plan. My impression is what you have is something for the state of Wyoming, not for Colorado, Nevada, Wisconsin, but something for the state of Wyoming that maybe, this is overstating, there's a laundry list for optional use locally. Planning is a tough thing, no doubt about it. But if you've got a laundry list, overstated, or if you've got a litany of things that may possibly work for locals to choose from, are we still whistling through the graveyard? And I won't tell you no more about that.
Game of fish?
That's critical, but think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly, I don't have a good answer for you other than time is going to tell. In a lot of cases, we frankly still need better CWD prevalence data to make some informed decisions. And in other cases, I mean, We've got some managers that have been thinking about this for quite a while now, and
There's another statement about planners. You know, say, what is 2 plus 2? And they say, I just don't have enough data.
So I think one thing that's critical too is that, while yes, this is as a plan, this is going to be a fluid, living, dynamic document. What you see today may be revised next week, 2 weeks from now, not that soon, but so we're going to be looking at this constantly, and so it could be revised next year if something new comes up or we get some new research or something. So just because what you see today doesn't mean this is what you're going to see for the next 5 years or 10 years and stuff. So we're going to be pretty dynamic, and the commission's made it pretty clear that they want updates on this and where we're going and what we've done and where we've been. So I think that's important, that what we stamp today, or once the commission stamps it, it's a done deal and it gets put on the shelf and we don't look at it again.
Right, think of this as a starting point, because it really is a starting point. Let's see what works, and we can go from there.
Yes. Kind of what I see this as, and I'm comparing it to invasive species. And you just have, whether it's weeds or whatever, you aren't going to be able to eradicate it, as you said, but you have to have a place to start. And you have to try different things in different places, and so it's kind of like a strategic plan, but it changes all the time. But you just have to have a place to start, and I'm thrilled to death that the effort has gone in to get this started. And thank you for that.
thank you.
Other thoughts, other concerns? Make sure Game and Fish knows it. Yes, ma'am.
So with water sources, I didn't see anything in like what was on the outlines for water sources, but do these prions, I assume they can travel downstream?
Mary, you're already
Yes.
nodding your head.
Yes.
Again, what we don't know is what it takes to set up an infection. Is it one prion?
Right.
That's a lot more serious, right, than say a million, whatever. So yeah.
And when we're considering water sources, I kind of glossed over, like that little slide about like guzzlers, like we were
Right,
about.
yeah.
No, certainly there's recognition there that, we're not going to go to cattle producers of Wyoming and say we recommend, we get rid of stock ponds across the state or something like that. So we have to recognize all those other realities as well. But it's just kind of just one more thing to consider, I guess. But certainly when animals concentrate around some of those areas, it could be a source of
Yeah, 'cause
transmission.
I know the muleys on our place, like where the beaver dams are, they really like the beaver dams. And they just kind of hang out.
True. Sure they do.
But, of course, I like the willows too. There's a lot of cover there.
Yeah.
They like the alfalfa field.
Yes,
they do.
Yes, they do. There's all over the state that.
All right.
Pretty tasty when you shoot them.
Well, and what's nice about our place is we have cover, but not enough cover. So they come in and spend all summer. And at times I can count, there's 350 acres of irrigated meadow in there. And at times you can count 50 to 60 head of deer on it. Come fall, they're gone. They moved back up the Little Laramie Valley to more cover.
Sure.
Okay, any other last questions? I think we're petering out. All right, one more question, yes.
If we're at the beginning stage of this, right, of trying to combat management, we've identified the problem, and now we've come up with some potential solutions, but they're gonna be experimental in nature. Wouldn't it be best to get the prevalence of this identified as solidly as we can? Why not do a mandatory for all hunters hunting elk or deer in the state? I understand we can only do 16,000 samples a year, but if we do this as a one-time thing in the very beginning, and everyone submits their samples, and you guys start farm it out to other universities, other approved laboratories, to do a one-time, one season, the entire state and get the best numbers you can in totality. You might not have to do a mandatory later, then you can actually see on your hotspot map how it actually correlates to the rest of the state, rather than just Southeast Wyoming has its little leg going out, and then we're getting one coming down through the center. Why not just do it mandatory across the entire state for one season, suck up the cost, get it done one time, and have a stronger baseline of what your prevalence most likely is.
So I'll largely kick this to Hank, but one thing to consider on that is that with lab capacity issues, like you pointed out in your comment, you know, we have to recognize that, but also the one thing about CWD, because it is such a slow progressing disease, you don't see this huge annual variation in it. So you don't jump from, let's say, 10% prevalence to 30% prevalence in the course of a year or even a couple years. And so we don't really have, it is what that does is that enables us on a rotating schedule every 5 years or so to really hit some select herds hard and get an understanding of prevalence and then revisit that on a rotating schedule. And that can still inform your, you know, information about prevalence and potential management decisions. So we don't really need to do that.
So that's a stronger baseline for you to go off of for I guess the entire population of our deer and elk in the state of Wyoming. Is that a strong enough baseline to cover all those to where you guys can say, or are you just going off percentages? So this area has 78%, this area has 5%.
So we do have good statistical numbers on several of our, many of our both deer and elk herds. So it's not like that we don't have perfect data. Our data actually isn't so bad, but we're in the process of trying to get those herd units where we've not sampled intensively enough to get a good handle on prevalence. So within the next, what do we figure, 3 years, 4 years, we should have all of our herd units covered, or the vast majority of them, and have a good handle on prevalence. So you make a great point. Wouldn't it be nice to just rip this Band-Aid off and get a big sample and be done with it, or at least get an initial idea of what's going on? But the problem is it's a lot for our field personnel to handle, because like Justin said, we harvest somewhere around 70,000 deer and elk combined in the state. Dude, that's a lot of samples. For everybody, that's a lot of samples. Yeah, but it's a good point.
All right, anything else?
Okay.
Okay.
Do the animals that have the genotype that they show to have prolonged life, are they in one area, or do we know where those animals are at? Are they expanding?
Did you want me to answer? So I don't know that we have a true map of Wyoming right now that says where all of those genetics are. There are some data that we have in certain areas to suggest that perhaps we are seeing a shift in some of those genetics. I think more data is necessary to get a feel for the distribution. What we have seen is in areas where we don't have CWD, those genetics are quite rare. Particularly the genetics that let them live the longest. Like 2% of your population are going to have those genetics. So I don't know if we have location data to go with that to say exactly where those are, but they're pretty rare. And then research that we're doing with University of Wyoming, and then as well as research that's actually already been done, suggests that in areas where there's a lot of CWD, that might start to shift a little bit. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and it hasn't shifted that much where we're at 5% in some of those areas where we've had CWD for a long time. Is that right, 5?
Yeah, so I think part of it is the heterozygotes are increasing, not so much the homozygotes. Yeah.
My memory's bad, but didn't Thorne go to the refuge and get quite a few calves? You know about that study?
Which study would that be?
It was up Seville. Thorne went up, and the way I heard it, he got a large number of calves. This was before he died in the car accident. He got them, put them in Seville. All he did, because Tom was a great one to say the elk aren't prevalent in this, it's deer. And every calf died. just synopsizing this for you. Every calf died, contractor that died, there was one calf left. And that's my question, what happened to her?
Oh,
She
so
lived
that
a long time.
is that Terry Krieger's study?
You must be thinking of the vaccine study. It was a brucellosis
Oh.
vaccine study to start with?
It wasn't a vaccine study. It was just a contraction study.
I'm guessing.
They all got it, they all died except
That's
one.
probably, that must have been in conjunction with one of Beth's study where they were doing
That's
a
one of Beth's study.
titration study?
Yeah, and then they were pinning their hopes on genetics, that's why I brought it up. They thought that calf had some genetics to it, and then I heard later, and that's why I'm asking the question, that calf also died. At a long age, she hung on for many years.
Well, we do have one elk that's still surviving out at
I'm
Sabile.
a little hard to hear.
I say we do have one elk that's still surviving out at Sabile, but I don't know, because I don't know exactly what study you're referring to, if she is the calf. I don't know that.
What's the age on that?
She's 18.
Is she 18?
So, a couple of years ago at one of the County Commissioner Association meetings, Scott Talbot came to talk, and he talked about that particular cow. So I had a question about that. Did she ever calve? And what happened with her calves?
So yes, that elk, at least if it's the one I think you're talking about,
And
yes.
He was talking about she was about 18 or
Mhm.
19 or something like that.
Yep.
Old cow.
So yes, she has successfully raised calves, although not in recent years. And those calves all got CWD.
But she was detected.
No,
She was
No.
never detected. was
no.
Thank you. That was a question I had.
Okay. Any more questions? This is great. Thank you so much for all your participation. I just wanted to say that I've taken the suggestions that I heard, I put them up here, I'm going to be compiling them. I'm going to give them to the working group for their consideration. But I've also handed out, this form. So take this home and you can put more comments up on the website if you want to. If there's something that you just want to write down right now and give to me, I'd love it, okay? So we really want to make sure we get all your comments. Thank you very much.
So to follow up to that, give comments, suggestions, but also when usually we get comments, it's always negative stuff, but if there's stuff in the plan that you also totally believe and support, please provide that too. Not just, negative stuff, because usually that's what we get for a comment, I don't like this, but if you have something you truly support or you just support the plan in general, please provide that as well, either through the comment form or through the electronic online commenting portal. Commenting is open to January 15th. And then all the comments will be compiled, taken to the working group for further discussion, review, etc., and possibly inclusion in the plan. Before we wrap up, I want to offer Luke or Martin, as members of the working group, any comments from their perspective, working group perspective, or anything that you'd like to say with regards to the process or the plan. Luke?
I just want to extend my thanks to the commission, the department, Director Nesbitt, and Hank, Mary. The education effort you've done for the CWD to me has just been amazing. I think that Director Nesbitt's leadership on this subject's just been amazing. I appreciate his outreach efforts with DEQ, with the county commissioners, YDOT, on this subject. So I just want to say thank you for all those efforts.
Thank you, Luke. Martin, as a member?
It's an intense process, an incredible learning process. You bring 32 minds into one room and try to get an outcome, and I think we came up with a pretty good list of recommendations, and you guys developed an amazing plan, so thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Commissioner Brocco, anything that you'd like to say as a member of the commission?
I do have a few comments. While new to the commission, it's a great learning curve, and I appreciate the public's input, and I can't stress enough how important local input is to current leadership and the current beliefs that the commission have. As Wyoming, we hold very dear those beliefs that local people make the best local decision. And the point of that comment is when we start talking about the statewide plan, and you're right, the commission did task the department with addressing CWD. But that was because the public has told the department how important a robust mule deer population is in the state. So when you think about CWD, that's one component that we're dealing with. We're dealing with that, migration corridors, urban development, oil and gas development, overused habitat, wild horses, elk. All those factors affect our mule deer, and this plan is just addressing CWD, so keep that in mind. And so there are management options that we as a commission will take into consideration when local regions bring those to us for what we're going to do with those herd units. So it's a very complex situation. The other thing I wanted to stress is the commission is dedicated to financing mule deer. We just re-upped financing for another 5 years on the entire statewide mule deer initiative. We continue to work with Dr. Monteith and his mule deer studies. We continue to support, find funding, and will support and continue to fund any sportsman that wants their animal tested at no charge to that sportsman, for the human health, for their confidence in what they're feeding their families. Those are huge, important issues to us, and we'll just continue to keep financing that. I thank you for participating. I think the department is full of very educated people doing great work. But they're directed by the local people, so continue to be involved with all aspects of your wildlife, and it was a good meeting. I'm glad I came.
Thank you, Commissioner, appreciate that. Well, again, thank you all you folks for coming out tonight on this wintry night at this time of the year when there's a lot of things going on with families and friends and schools and activities. And again, please, please, please read the plan, provide us comments, what you like, what you don't like, what maybe we think we should change or add, and again, that'll all be reviewed and considered into the final plan. But again, depending on what we get for commenting in the working group meeting in February, we will take this plan for commission review and approval either at the March Commission meeting in Cody or the April Commission meeting in Riverton. So with that, everybody have a safe travel home and a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Thanks for coming.